And so it has to be defended. And it has to be defended institutionally because it can't be defended factually. We can't debate this factually.
Lysine being one of these essential amino acids.
And it happens to be globally limiting, which shouldn't be surprising because the two greatest categories of crude protein supply in humanity's diet are wheat end products and rice end products. And they're both very poor quality when you consider them from this digestible, indispensable amino acid score basis. It can't be done because currently half of the farmers in the world are dependent on livestock manure for fertilizer. A significant number of farmers in the world are still dependent on draft animals. And sacrifice them at the end of the study to determine body composition.
Right.
Hard to find volunteers for, in other words, sit down, Pete, I got this.
Tell me who you are and what you do.
I'm Peter Ballerstedt, otherwise known as Don Pedro, the sod father of the Ruminati. And I have a little effort I call Grass-Based Health.
Now, you look familiar. I think I've seen you before.
One or two places.
On episode 10 of this podcast.
Why, I think you're right.
Except for one thing.
What's that?
It's only on Spotify. It's not on YouTube.
Oh, that's unfortunate.
So let's go ahead and just get to the elephant in the room with a caveat that we're going to try to not repeat what happened before. So here's what happened. As best as I can tell, we record an episode. As far as I was concerned, there was nothing really that controversial about it compared to what I normally see on all the social media streaming channels that podcasts host. However, when we released your episode, something weird happened. By that point, I said that you were episode number 10. We had 9 other episodes before yours. They all steadily grew, and we knew about what kind of traffic there was. I mean, it's true some weren't as popular as others, but generally speaking, the channel was growing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then yours got released, and it wasn't just down; it was under 10% of what the last few episodes were.
Mm-hmm.
The growth rate was just flat. And I thought, I don't understand what's going on.
Well, it could have been the guest.
Yeah.
Or the host. I mean,
yes.
But...
Well, so there's something kind of special about this podcast. It's actually good for an experiment like this because one of the first places you might go is, oh, maybe it's the title or the thumbnail. But no, our titles are actually not that ridiculous generally, not compared to other titles you'll see on YouTube. Trust me, go look at other titles on YouTube. But sometimes it's the thumbnail, but our thumbnails are all the same. They just say who the person is as a guest, and then what the number is of the. I've gotten a lot of dings for not being, more clickbaity. So as a test, it was a pretty good test, and it'd be one thing if it was down 25%, 50%. Maybe nobody's interested in, the sod father. Maybe you have a whole bunch of people who had seen you before and would choose not to click on it. But no, less than 10%. That was a kind of a crisis moment for us because, podcast is new, trying to build it. We have people showing up in person like you, and you took the time to come here and do this whole episode. It's multi-hours. So, spoiler alert for everyone. Where it ended up is that we ultimately got advice from a couple people who are close to YouTube that really the only solution would be to fully remove the episode. And by that, I mean not just even take it private, but to delete it. Now, I initially pushed back on that advice and said, well, okay, I think Peter will understand that episode will stand out for being suppressed. But then all other episodes in our channel itself, they were all being affected.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of a chilling moment for me.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do in that kind of situation?
Well, you do what you did, which was to pull that content and see if the views on all those others recover and your channel recovers, because ultimately that's the most important thing for you. And so we had that conversation, and I encouraged you to do that, and that I fully understood. And so what happened?
So, ta-da! All of a sudden, all of the videos were regaining their normal trajectory of increases in views. And I had a really tough time with it. You were so understanding from like minute one. This isn't like a typical podcast where we're talking over Zoom. People are physically taking their time to come here.
Mm-hmm.
And so here all of a sudden I had a sample size of 10 and I have a 10% self-censor rate, right? Because naturally the next question people are going to ask is, did I try to reach out and contact YouTube? And I did try that. I'm concerned that if I talk about it, that maybe that puts this channel at risk. So I don't know how much ongoing relations is going to turn out to be relevant. But that was a moment where I thought, man, this, the one thing that I really was counting on with this podcast was that you could talk about anything.
Mm-hmm.
But particularly given the fact that truly people can listen to episode 10 on Spotify right now, on Apple Music right now. By the way, no change in the viewership. It wasn't like dropped off there, so it wasn't the common denominator that was you.
Oh, well, that's a relief.
But if you listen to that episode, I would argue that you did not sound like some extremist.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I can think of is that it was the topic that I don't even want to say out loud because I'm afraid this will get suppressed.
Voldemort.
Exactly. Voldemort. I was actually going to bring two props. I'll describe the props. One was going to be a globe, and the other was going to be like a farm animal that goes moo. That it was the combination of the two and that possible relevance, which again, I can't stress enough. I really don't feel like you represented, if there was a spectrum, right, between like one far end of the spectrum and the other far end of the spectrum, I felt like you were pretty close to like moderate one side, not way out on the other side. And I hate that even in this moment that I feel like I'm walking on eggshells just talking about it.
Well, and I guess I'm somewhat surprised that other topics that are content don't receive a similar treatment.
Right.
Because in many ways, the subject that we assume was the trigger are integrated, they're self-reinforcing in the conversation space. And part of that is we know what a healthy diet should be, right?
Right.
And then we know that this negative effect, and so they're used as reinforcing arguments, right? Bad for you, bad for the planet, what's the loss? And so it's kind of surprising that that's the one that's left now, because it seems to me like people should know by now that the fear over animal source foods in general being the cause of increased risk for various diseases, it's at least being debated now. And of course, now there's this little thing that happened a month or so ago that we may get to in terms of revision of dietary guidelines. And so some of this is should have been at least as controversial, except maybe what it is this is one of the few things remaining in the quiver. And so it has to be defended. And it has to be defended institutionally because it can't be defended factually. We can't debate this factually. And, there's lots of things we could go down that road. And my interest has always been to say, well, there's this information perhaps you weren't aware of. And so let's deal with that. I've been trying to come up with a mission statement for grass-based health. And one of them, one version is that grass-based health is striving to restore metabolic health by bridging and integrating agriculture and medicine and nutrition.
I'm actually pulling it up right now if you want me to go ahead and read it.
Please.
So you sent this to me, and yeah, you kind of summarized it, but I want to read it in full. It says, grass-based health exists to restore human metabolic health by bridging agriculture, nutrition, and medicine, translating and integrating knowledge across these fields to demonstrate how ruminant systems deliver essential ecosystem services, particularly the production of nutrient-dense foods to address chronic disease driven by malnutrition and metabolic dysfunction. So, only because I know some people may not know, tell us about ruminants. What do you mean by ruminants?
Ruminants are that family of animals that have a multi-compartmented stomach, technically pre-gastric fermentation. So if you think of us, we have an acidic stomach. So in front of that, put 3 stomachs, essentially. And 2 of those are all about fermenting high fiber, low fat, poor protein quantity and quality biomass, primarily plant material. And the microbes that are the drivers of that fermentation process produce byproducts as well as themselves that the host organism then absorbs or harvests. So, for example, byproducts of this fermentation process are short chain saturated fatty acids that are volatile, as well as microbial protein. They also produce some methane. Moving right along,
right?
The volatile fatty acids are absorbed through the rumen wall, and the microbial protein is used to make more bugs, technical term. And then as that material flows down through first a structure that absorbs some of the moisture out of that, and then into an acidic stomach, the cow, sheep, goat, deer, buffalo, bison, as I said, many, many kinds, they end up digesting that protein. Those microorganisms are digested by the host animal. And so the remarkable thing is that a cow or any other ruminant really doesn't have any essential amino acids in its diet. And it really doesn't have any essential fatty acids in its diet. But there are 2 forms of carbohydrate that are essential in a ruminant's diet. The ruminant has to have both structural and non-structural carbohydrate in its diet in order for that rumen micro environment to function properly. So structural, that would be cellulose. Non-structural, that would be sugar and starch and other components. And so they both have to be present. They have to be present in the right amounts in order for the microorganisms to function properly. Now, humans, on the other hand, we have essential amino acids.
Right.
And we have essential fatty acids. But I've been told that there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate in a human's diet. And it's that sort of fit, that ecological fit, that I think is a powerful story about why these ruminant animals are essential in our food system.
So let me see if I can unpack this and you correct me. The reason you state it the way that you do, that there's no essential amino acids in a ruminant's diet. Essential means you need to get it from outside your body.
Right.
It's got to be in your diet. So when a ruminant is, if you were to say, hey, are you making sure this ruminant's getting enough protein in their diet? Technically speaking, you could say it makes the protein that's in its body.
You could say that as long as I have somewhere in the mid to upper teens, so 15 to 18% crude protein, depending on the stage of development in the species, then, and there's sufficient energy for the microbes to function properly, then that is going to allow them to form all the amino acids out of that crude protein. And crude protein says nothing about the amino acid composition.
What?
Yes.
Sorry, little inside joke.
Indeed.
Yes. So in other words, because crude protein is distinguished by nitrogen, right?
Right. Crude protein is one aspect of feed or food quality.
Right.
And it's based on a percent nitrogen analysis. We then multiply that percent nitrogen by 6.25 to convert it from percent nitrogen to percent crude protein. And we assume that all the nitrogen that was in that sample was in protein, and all that protein was 16% nitrogen. So that's the justification for using 6.25. And it's a very old technique. It goes back into the mid to late 1800s. And it works okay for ruminants. It's not at all appropriate for monogastrics, so that swine nutritionists have been balancing their rations, on the basis of individual indispensable or essential amino acids for 40 years at least. And we're still not talking about them adequately in human nutrition at the popular level. Clearly, there are researchers doing that work, but it hasn't really moved very far into policy or recommendations. And certainly in the popular space, it's not received the appropriate attention, by my opinion.
Well, yes. So the larger point I was getting to is that ruminants, given the story you're telling us, are themselves protein-creating factories.
Right. I could dig out the reference, but even in the United States, under our production systems, beef cattle are net positive protein contributors to our food supply. In other words, they provide more human utilizable protein than they consume.
Right. But conversely, us humans, yes, our nucleated cells are also protein factories, but there's a catch. We can't make all of the amino acids. That's where the word essential comes back into play.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have essential amino acids that we need in our diet.
Very much.
Because we cannot get them except outside of ourselves.
Indeed. And the tricky bit comes in that we don't need them all in the same amount. And our ability to utilize all of the amino acids are going to be limited by the essential amino acid that's present in the lowest amount relative to its requirement.
Right. Literally the weakest link.
Short stave, yes. But there's another phrase for that. But and you could probably see other examples of where the limiting agent is the one that needs to be addressed before you could see significant progress.
Right. But this is, in a roundabout way, you're practically pitching the talk I gave back in 2019, that original Carnivoricon that we both spoke at, that was through Amber O'Hearn, who, by the way, I've had on here, who's awesome. And what I liked, and I still love it, I love this analogy of the ribosomes in our cells that make the proteins as using amino acids in the same way that a printer would use color cartridges.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that you're printing, it depends a lot on the colors you're printing as to what levels of the toner of the different types it's using. And it's the same way with us. So just as you mentioned, we don't use the same amino acids at the same quantities. What then would likely have the most comparable complement of amino acid usage? Plants or animals? And that's an easy question for me to answer now because of what I went through trying to make a diet. And I kept running into this. I kept running into, dang it, I can't easily come up with the full complement of amino acids from a plant-based diet in the same way that I can do an animal-based diet, right? Now, this is not a larger dictate that you can't have a plant-based diet. It's just, you do have to be more mindful towards specifically the amino acid complement relative to a meat-based diet, because animals are making the same kinds of proteins, relatively speaking, that we are.
Yeah, eat what you are.
To an extent.
But you don't need to take that literally. So is, again, Amber O'Hearn, because I was just reviewing her 2019 presentation that she gave at KetoCon. To make a kidney, you don't need to eat kidney, right? To have a brain, you don't need to eat brain. But on the other hand, these animal source foods have long been recognized as having the highest quality protein, but it's been relatively recently that we've developed an assay that lets us look at each individual amino acid and its digestibility. And so people have spoken very confidently about combining different foods because we don't eat just protein, nor do most people eat just beef. We're going to have beef as part of a mixed diet, many people. But there was a paper recently which said that basically, my interpretation, this gets very complicated the further away you get from, and then you could find the right adjective to describe the diet. So the more artificial you make the diet, by my understanding, that is, the more you restrict animal source foods, the more you need to know these rules and measurements. And the easiest thing is just to make sure that you have animal source foods in your diet, whatever's appropriate, whatever due to your background and your personal choices, whatever is affordable and accessible to you. So Dr. Ballerstedt says to be sure to take your daily meds, which is an acronym that stands for meat, eggs, dairy, seafood. Okay, now I got that from somebody else, like I got all my better ideas from somebody else. And I'm not a medical doctor, so nobody should treat anything I say as medical advice. I'm not a human nutritionist. I do have some training in animal nutrition and specifically ruminant nutrition, which gives me a perspective then that I can apply toward human nutrition and go, oh my God. So the point is that people have made assertions about being able to combine grains and legumes to get complete protein on an animal source food free diet. But I've been assured by people doing work that says things like an 8-year-old boy couldn't meet his lysine requirements eating rice and lentils if he had unlimited supply.
Lysine being one of these essential amino acids.
And it happens to be globally limiting, which shouldn't be surprising because the two greatest categories of crude protein supply in humanity's diet are wheat end products and rice end products. And they're both very poor quality when you consider them from this digestible, indispensable amino acid score basis, which is what we've been told we should be using since 2013. In the United States, people tend to get more concerned about leucine as another indispensable amino acid. But from a global perspective, my understanding is that it's lysine because, again, humanity's diet's already plant-based. The majority of our calories are coming from plant-source foods. The majority of our crude protein is coming from plant-source foods.
Now, I can't remember if we covered this in the last episode, but I wouldn't mind if we cover it again anyway, because I never feel like this can get covered enough. If I look at a label right now and I see protein, let's say it's, 25 grams of protein, then I'm like, that's great. 25 grams of protein sounds like a lot for this serving. Mm-hmm. What might I be missing?
Well, first of all, 25 grams, if I'm remembering Protein Power, Michael and Mary Dan Eads' book, which is what I got started on back in 2007, that's pretty close to what you should be getting at every meal. The problem is that's crude protein. The other problem is you've got a plus or minus 20% around that value on a label.
Yeah, but it says protein on the label.
Right, exactly. And it's telling you an amount. So I just want to say that when you look at a table or a label, there's some tolerance around those values. And so treating them as a hard number, and you just think about it. Plant source foods vary tremendously. When I graduated in '86 from the University of Kentucky, I went into a world where we were training our hay growers and sellers on how to take an appropriate sample of the hay so it could be tested so that you could market it better and you could emphasize its quality to dairymen so why is that? Well, we were telling these growers that every lot of hay needed to be tested. And so a lot was defined as basically a field planted to the same variety with no differences in soils and management, from the same cutting. All of those things made significant difference to the nutritive value of the hay. And once upon a time, I had reason to look into a database of soybean values, and there were some 5,000 entries in this database. And it was an incredible variation in the crude protein content of those soybeans. Okay, so plant source foods vary more than animal source foods. just the nature of the beasts. And specifically to your question, that protein value is, again, a crude protein value.
And that has special meaning, right? Crude versus
let me, true or
right. Like when we're normally talking about protein, we're talking about polypeptide chains. We're talking about literally the amino acid strings. Most people, if they write into Google, they'll see the interesting multicolor ribbon-y stuff, right? And again, our nucleated cells are protein factories. They're constantly making proteins, and they make up, so much of who we are.
For a variety of functions, yes.
Exactly, for a variety of functions. But that's what we think about when we hear protein. That if I put a bunch of protein in this bucket and I disintegrate it down to its smallest organic parts, they're going to be amino acids and only amino acids. But that's not true, is it?
You're right. That's not true. A crude protein value, as I stated earlier, is based on a percent nitrogen value. So if I have a green leafy vegetable, for example, it would be reasonable to expect a certain amount of that nitrogen to be non-protein nitrogen. So if those green leafy vegetables have a significant amount of nitrate in them, which they will, then a certain amount of that nitrogen is going to be there in nitrate. But it's still going to be part of the percent nitrogen multiplied by 6.25 and mathematically converted into crude protein. It's not protein. Now, on the animal side, there'll be some peptides that are shorter chains that aren't proteins, but they still have nutritive value to us. And so the non-protein nitrogen content of plants is always going to be higher than the non-protein nitrogen content of animal source foods, such that even potatoes, which sometimes are touted as a high protein yielding crop just because of the raw weight that you can produce per acre, maybe a quarter of that protein is non-protein nitrogen. And I remember a certain conversation with a certain very intelligent man, and I wish I had the picture of his face at that moment.
Yeah.
Because, it just doesn't seem right to be doing that. Again, that's worked okay for ruminants because ruminants can take non-protein nitrogen. Well, specifically the microorganisms they host in their rumens can capture that rumen degradable nitrogen and make microbial protein out of it. And so that's a really important function within the overall ecosystem and specifically our food systems.
So, of course, we're getting a bit geeky, but this is important because right now, if I'm pulling up a plant-sourced product and I'm looking at the protein, what you're telling me right now is some amount of what's stated as protein is not made of amino acids.
Correct.
Right. And I should not even think of as protein. And the problem is that that's not being identified to me.
Correct. And in addition, the amino acid composition of those products matters tremendously. And the digestibility and therefore our ability to absorb those amino acids is going to vary tremendously. So, for example, one of the reasons that cereals tend to be so limiting in lysine is, first of all, because they tend to have a relatively low content of lysine to begin with. But then because of the other components, i.e. carbohydrate, and we don't eat raw wheat berries, for example, we process those into some other food item. We make a brown, crusty wheat bread out of it, or we toast them into crackers or whatever. That toasting actually is a combination of, and the browning is a combination of lysine reacting non-enzymatically with carbohydrate. Because it's non-enzymatic, we don't have the enzymes to break those. So now that lysine becomes unavailable. And so we take something that had little lysine to begin with, relatively speaking, and we make it even poorer from a nutritional perspective. So,
and when you're saying it that way, when you're saying, terms like bioavailable, what people need to take from that is how much does what you're consuming actually end up in circulation in your body to be picked up by your cells, right?
Yes.
And the problem is that a lot of people don't realize this. All foods, getting back to that label, what's on that label isn't a one-to-one with every kind of food as to what actually ends up in your body.
Mm-hmm.
You still need to be mindful of digestibility.
Mm-hmm. And
this even includes combinations of food.
Very much.
Which we'll get into in a moment. But
so back to what I call the plant pucks, which are the Impossible and the Beyond Burger patties, right? So the way I keep them straight in my mind is that Impossible has S's in it. And so that's soybean. And has been the primary protein source for that product. Beyond used pea protein isolate. Well, pea protein isolate doesn't qualify as a good source of protein label claim. Just the value of it is such. Okay, so you can put a lot of that into a product, but it's not a good source. And therefore, the Beyond Burger puck doesn't qualify as a good source of protein. Now, the Impossible, because of the soy, and the soy does qualify for a good source of protein label claim, but nobody eats those pucks by themselves, right? We don't go to In-N-Out Burger and order them and have them bunless. And so you're going to slide them between two pieces of wheat bread. And there's not enough lysine in the Impossible Burger to make up for the lack of lysine in the wheat bread. So as a meal, it no longer qualifies as a good source of protein label claim. And again, this gets really complicated. As one author said, it's a lot to digest. And they intended that. And the point that they wanted to make is, if you just include muscle meat or, in your meals, you don't have to worry about these things, because there's such an excess of the essential amino acids that are lacking in these other foods that they can balance. And we can now look at that with this technology. And Frances Moore Lappé did not have that in 1968 when she published A Diet for a Small Planet, which, by the way, was cited as a reference in the dietary goals document that came out of McGovern's committee and influenced a lot of thinking going forward. And some of these things have been acknowledged as being mistakes since. The problem is, once these myths are launched, then you have what Mike Eads refers to as zombie myths. You can't kill them.
Right.
And you may be familiar with a few of these.
I might, and without the risk of stating something, I could say just sort of broadly, like with what you were describing, the goals with regard to nutrition were outside nutrition, right? So presumably, if you're trying to make decisions on what to recommend for people to eat, with regard to specifically nutrition guidelines, right? Presumably, it would be about the nutrition, unless it was something like nutrition and fill in the blank guidelines. That I feel like would be a lot more explicit.
And they've tried that, and they've been smacked down. But the fact that we still don't have, well, the fact that we're still debating whether some nutrients are essential, right? That list isn't like, hasn't been chiseled in stone, right? So all of this, and as friends of ours would say, most of our understanding of that is based on our experience with carbohydrate-fed people.
Mm.
And so under that background, then, some of these nutrients we have a certain need for, but if we move away from that to any degree, then, that might shift things. We have reason to suspect that.
But probably a good example of this would be vitamin C. I think that probably vitamin C is essential. The larger question is to what degree it is. Do we know between us a number of people who are genuinely very strict carnivores? We do, right? It would have been presumed, certainly by me, back when I was watching Amber O'Hearn's first, I think it was on a low-carb cruise. I was watching her talk on the carnivore diet. I was like, whoa, no. And I myself was going, oh, she's going to experience scurvy eventually.
And where's she going to get her fiber?
Yeah. And that was the other thing was, really, though? Really? Could you go entirely without fiber? And as often happens throughout history, certain people are going, no, I think this is sustainable, and I'm going to take the chance. I'm going to experiment and try it.
Lately, I've been using a quote from a document that I received, long story. And it basically goes something like, I could look it up, but science has now conclusively shown that meat does not cause disease. And in the past, there have been many erroneous beliefs about meat causing, and then there's a long list of diseases that would include, heart disease, kidney trouble, gout, Now, thanks to the modern science of nutrition and careful scientific investigation, we not only know that meat doesn't cause these diseases, but may play a role in the treatment of those very diseases it was once blamed for. I'm paraphrasing. 1933.
Wow.
And so when I speak to some audiences that aren't familiar, they haven't heard Amber O'Hearn or any of the other people we could name, I say, well, how did we get from there then to here now? Because that list of diseases sounds a lot like what many contemporaries would say, in fact, meat is a risk factor for. And so how did we get from, and if you don't know that background, then that's going to be a hindrance for us making progress going forward. Because we have to understand that story, I think. It's my perspective.
Yeah. And, I want to be optimistic. I have really loved AI for many different applications. And one of those is helping us with Own Your Labs, our sponsor. You know what? I don't have the cards, but I would flash an Own Your Labs thing because this made it for a good segue to say that get your private blood work through us. We're our only sponsor, and we try to keep it that way for limited commercial interruption. Okay. I love AI for the purposes of things like coding because it allows our team to be much, much smaller than it would have needed to be for the kinds of things we accomplish. But this brings me back to literally the beginning of this podcast and referencing the podcast before with you on it. Let's talk about zombie myths bolstered by algorithmic control, right? So the thing you're concerned about that you just now described, I totally believe. I believe that this concept of meat causing disease, at least as far as that I've been able to see, virtually any food, any whole food, and I'm going to include plants in this one for the moment, any whole food application of that diet without some intermediary in its preparation and how it's cooked and so forth, has not been very compelling to me to believe that it's just directly causative of that disease. So I'm even going to be a little bit, I might surprise a lot of my low carb friends right now, because I'll say that I've known people on a very plant predominant diet who, as far as I can tell, of the few that I know, haven't seemed to have developed a lot of like allergies and so forth. More the people that I know who find themselves needing to get away from a plant predominant diet because they're more sensitive to oxalates and things along those lines, would themselves concede they had not the best diet before. Right. So where we get to a point that we're in a more diseased state, and how much that relates back to the modern food environment, having less to do with the particular things that we ate that our ancestors ate before, but more to do with the new additives and the new ways in which we prepare the food, I think that's still an open debate and a fair one. But a bunch of people, particularly in the last 100 years, have said it's this particular thing like red meat. It's this particular thing like processed meat. Right.
Indeed.
That we can then point to and say that's causative of the disease. How we know that is through very sophisticated, statistical models and so forth. That's a common one. But the problem is that, as you said, I think that it's so persistent.
Well, and it's also conflated with some other belief systems. And so the people who, rather than ecologists or environmentalists, a distinction that maybe only I appreciate, so I'll just let it go by, but people who will say things like, look at all the land that's used to raise livestock, and look at how much resources are fed to livestock that could be fed to people. And so, just to take two, there would be the land use argument and there would be the feed food competition argument. Now, those go back again to Ms. Lepay and Mr. Ehrlich, and I'm struggling not to use adjectives. But they were disputed at the time. And that's been the case all along. So when I say to you that, science didn't get us where we are, and science is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are other factors in play here.
Right.
But just to go back and deal with the land use, for example, the majority of the land surface area is not even considered agricultural. So I use the model of a U.S. football field. And if you imagine between the goal lines and the sidelines to be the land area of the world entire, then something approaching 47% of the land area would be called rangeland by range scientists. It's an ecological description. From a use perspective, agricultural is going to be somewhere around 38 per yard line from its own goal line. So small amount. Okay. Then there's a category, though it's a subcategory of agricultural land. It's called arable land. And arable land is the land that's suitable for the production of annual crops, tillage, those sorts of things, vegetables, cereals, pulses, legumes. That'd get you to about the 11-yard line. And so the vast majority of the agricultural land should not be tilled. When we've done it in the past, we've seen major problems. Think Dust Bowl. Okay, and it's still a problem globally. A lot's been invested in the United States for soil conservation. It's still a problem. Water and wind erosion. Okay. We have a system in the United States of classes of soils, and class ones are the best. They're the most fertile, they're the most resilient, they're the ones you have to do the least to preserve them. Unfortunately, that's not a universal system, but if you look for comparable systems and kind of mash them together, that would get you to the 1 yard line.
So it's like 1%?
Less than 1%.
Less than 1% of the United States is this?
No, of the world.
Oh, of the world. Okay.
Is class 1 soils.
Huh.
The most resilient, the least susceptible to damage from cultivation. And so that's less than 1/10 of the arable land. And then we have to acknowledge that this is still in this artificial either or conversation. Like either you're going to grow crops or you're going to grow livestock. And that's not true. And in fact, there's a whole community of scientists who are looking at how to reintegrate livestock back into our cropping systems. In many parts of the world, that hasn't changed. We did that in the 60s and 70s. We had this specialization where we went from these diversified farms where you might have 2 or 3 kinds of livestock and several crops grown in rotation. And then we kind of went to all, got rid of the livestock, got rid of the fences, went to growing corn and soy and maybe some wheat in rotation. Some colleagues who work in Alberta said they have to tell farmers that canola snow is not a rotation. Right. So we've gotten much more simplified in terms of our rotations for a number of reasons, and that's not good. And it was never recognized as being good. We always talked about rotations as being necessary. This idea of crop rotations goes back to pre-industrial revolution Britain. And in fact, some people say this ley, L-E-Y system of farming is what generated, because of increased yield, generated the capital that drove development. And so what they discovered was if they grow clover and grass pastures and graze them for a couple years, and then plowed those out and went into a grain crop, which is the biggest nitrogen user, and grew 1 or 2 crops of that, and then went into a root crop, turnips or stock beets or something like that. By that time, they had produced a seed bed that they could plant pasture back into, and they had better yields because the clover fixed nitrogen from the atmosphere because of the bugs that live in its roots. And then because a grazing animal is going to excrete about 90% of the nutrients it consumes. And so you're going to build up fertility during that cycle, and then you're going to draw it down during the cropping cycles. But now you had these heavier crops that you needed to get to market. So you need better roads, you needed railways.
But what you're drilling into is, because a lot of people may not realize this, rotation it's the opposite of monocrops, right? Like
yes.
A monocrop is this field I've designated for wheat. I'm now going to till it, raise wheat on it, then repeat. Wheat again, wheat again, wheat again. Mm-hmm. But that's ultimately not good for the soil.
Nor for the wheat, because insects that feed on wheat or diseases that feed on wheat build up. Weeds that thrive under those conditions build up. And so then you have this competition. So as I say, it's been recognized for a long time that going through rotations is one of your principal means of pest control, because you're breaking cycles. So
then there's this thought, hey, why not bring livestock back?
Exactly.
But Peter, they would just trample all over the soil and, stamp it around on it and might poop on it. And
Oh, heavens, you mean apply organic fertilizer? Yes. So everything is in the context of proper management. And so this reintegration of livestock or cropping livestock systems, you would not have livestock on the crop. So one model that I've described that I learned about in Brazil, their cash crop, where the bulk of their money is going to come from, is growing soy. So they would plant that and then harvest it. In this particular area is southern Brazil, so it's comparable to northern Florida, southern Georgia in terms of climate. So when the soybeans are harvested, or shortly before, they're going to plant an annual grass mixture for pasture. And then at the appropriate time, they're going to start grazing weaned cattle on that to put some more weight on them until it's time to plant soybeans again. Now, because the soy is the cash crop, that's where they're going to make all their inputs. But somebody said, what if we fertilize the grass instead of the soy? So they did that in these experiments, and they got more grass. Good, that worked. We fertilize grass, we get more grass. Good, that's good. And because we had more grass, we got more beef. Good, that worked. Okay, good. The surprising part was that they got comparable soybean yields. So now we're getting more food produced on the same acres with comparable or lower inputs. And because we had a more vigorous grass pasture, we've gotten more vigorous root growth. And then because it's grazed, we have benefits to the soil above even growing that grass without grazing. So we've gone through this process in the United States where we had this, conventional tillage. Okay, then they said, in some places we want to go to reduced or no tillage. Okay, and then they said, well, but we want now, in addition to that, we want some cover crops grown so that we have growing plants on this soil for as long a period as that environment will permit. Okay. And then they've discovered, but having the actual herbivory, the actual grazing of animals, will yield benefits above the cover crops, which yielded benefits above the no-till, which yielded benefits over the conventional till.
It's almost like if we copy nature, nature rewards us.
Well, yeah, somebody said nature votes last. and so we're, we can do all these inputs, but the more we kind of align. But I'm not, I want to push back just a little bit and say nature is not abundant. And I define agriculture as the story of humanity modifying its environments to produce more edible biomass. Right? And that looks very different depending on where you are in the systems that were in place. But one narrative has focused on Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent, as being the beginning of agriculture. Well, there are other forms that took place using different animals, different crops in different parts of the world at roughly the same time around the world. And part of that, there's a measure or an estimate that we call net primary productivity, which is sort of the global photosynthetic activity. the fixing of atmospheric carbon dioxide into carbohydrate. And a good portion of that occurs in the marine environment. But then let's just focus on the terrestrial environment. And if you ask yourself, what percent of that is human edible? You're down below 5%.
Wow. Huh.
And even if you look, and then there's another estimate of the, what do they call it? The human appropriation of net primary productivity is agriculture, right? So the biomass, the plant biomass for agriculture, if you look at what's edible there by humans, you're less than 15%, 1.5.
So let's break that down a little bit. What you're telling me right now is I grow a plant. I can't eat the whole plant.
Correct. For the most part.
For the most part.
Right. If I grow a crop of wheat or corn, maize for our international listeners, less than half of that biomass from the soil surface all the way is human edible.
So what happens to it?
Right now, a significant amount of that is used as a feed resource to feed livestock, primarily ruminants. Now, a certain amount of the harvested grain isn't human edible as well. Maybe there's grade issues that make it not suitable for human consumption. Okay, that goes in. So about 1% of the global feed, about 1% of the feed going to support the global domesticated ruminant herd is that non-human suitable grain.
So if I'm playing devil's advocate, I would be saying, oh, well, that's not that much.
Well, you're right. It's not that much. The amount of grain going into these ruminant herds is about 10% of global production, 10. Which again is a different, right? And a lot of what goes into even U.S. ruminant systems, primarily beef, are byproducts. So we're producing ethanol from corn. The production of ethanol means we're utilizing that fermentable carbohydrate, which leaves protein. And so distillers' grains end up being a protein feed.
So getting to the usable land argument, because I hear this brought up quite a lot, is, yeah, we're using a lot of land to feed the livestock. So it's double the usage. If we just used only the land that we're using for livestock for crops instead, sure, some of it might not be of use, but there'd probably be a lot that would be of use. Have you worked these numbers yet? If we were to right now go out to everywhere where livestock is being raised and instead turn it into cropland, how much of that would actually convert?
Well,
or could be converted?
Yeah, no. So again, you've got 28% of the global land area is considered agricultural, but should never be cultivated. To do so would degrade the environment in significant ways, would reduce wildlife in significant ways, would lead to any number of problems that proper managed systems currently avoid. Fire suppression, for example. And people in California might be familiar with some of these issues. When you restrict grazing, biomass accumulates until it either burns or rots or is grazed, right? But we've taken grazing off the board, right? So, okay, there's that. And again, some preliminary analysis suggests that if we were to restrict all animal source foods, we couldn't produce enough soy. Because you can't grow soy on all of your arable land. It's restricted based on a number of factors of latitude, rainfall, growing degree days. All of those conditions restrict. Somebody once said you couldn't grow soy north of Bavaria in Germany.
So in a sense, what you're saying is, if I were, let's just say, king of the world, and I said, hey, we're all going plant-based.
Hail David, hail David.
By, 2030 or something like that. That's the dictate. We're taking meat entirely out of the diet, right? Make sure that you grow enough plants, particularly for where we can get sources of protein.
It can't be done because currently half of the farmers in the world are dependent on livestock manure for fertilizer. A significant number of farmers in the world are still dependent on draft animals. So are we giving everybody Kubotas? And are we going to deploy more natural gas to make into nitrogen fertilizer? And might that have some impacts, follow-on, secondary, that we don't? Okay, you get the idea. We still have 1 billion people in the world that are burning as their primary cooking fuel dung, which increases respiratory disease in women and children. Right. I mean, we are entertaining. In the wealthy countries of the world, people who are well-fed and very secure and have more money are entertaining ideas that are not serious, but somehow they've gotten themselves in positions of influence. And so we've got to deal with this. But the reality is the vast majority of human beings today are malnourished. And that malnourishment is what's driving chronic illness. And that occurs across all income level countries. And the primary driver of that is either the voluntary or involuntary lack of animal source foods in their diet. Now, I'm not that kind of dietitian or doctor, so I don't know what that amount is for each individual. But some amount is required. It's dang sure required for the proper development of fetuses. And it's really important for the health and well-being of their mothers. And we know from some studies that minimal sorts of interventions can produce measurable differences in the scholastic and societal behavior differences of their children at age 9. Now, you might be surprised to learn that I can be a bit hyperbolic at times. And in one particular time, I was sitting next to a gentleman whose life is dedicated to improving the ruminant agricultural systems and therefore the health and well-being of people in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and Southwest Asia. And I went off on a rant very similar to the one I just went on. And I made the point that we don't need blue sky technology. We don't need trillions of dollars spent making dictates about what isn't even, to anyone who has any degree of knowledge on this, they can tell you today that's not possible. And it's not likely to ever be possible. And so I was on that rant and I said, it's not a heavy lift. And he sighed, almost patted me on the head. And he said, it's achievable. So it's achievable. We can do this. And we've just completed the first quarter of the 21st century, and we're driving toward halftime. And we have all of these, goals that people have said by 2050, blah, 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 blah. One of them I find interesting, and I talk about it frequently. It says by 2050, there's going to be a 2/3 increase in demand for animal source protein. Okay. One, I'm going to tell you that's an underestimate for a number of reasons I could elaborate on. But let's just chase down this rabbit hole for a bit. It's based on the assumption that it's going to be a globally, this population, which is increasing, and that's one of the reasons that demand will increase, but it's going to become more prosperous. And as it becomes more prosperous, they'll be able to purchase these animal source foods that they want. And I want to say, is it always a follower? Might the access to greater amounts of animal source foods be a contributor to economic development? Are there any examples? Well, how about colonial North America? We had impoverished people from Europe come over to North America and suddenly have unimaginably greater access to meat, fish, and fowl, both wild and domestic. And they ate it in abundance. We have contemporary records of visitors coming over and going, oh my God, these people they eat meat at every meal and 3 meals a day, all day long. It's amazing. And within a generation or two, their progeny were a couple inches taller than they are. Increased height is a marker for increased physical strength. It's a marker for increased productivity. And clearly it preceded, economic prosperity as we currently think about it. So at least in some cases, and there are others we could look at, that a better fed population, by whatever definition, is a more productive population. Well, then we better get at defining what that better fed population means. And currently, there are a number of disciplines and communities of action where the implicit assumption of what characterizes a healthy diet is heavily influenced by the conventional wisdom that we're well acquainted with. And so part of my goal has been to try to put some pebbles in shoes and start thinking about this. Maybe, just maybe, more animal source food would be a contributor to development. Now, how do we do that so it's affordable? How do we do that so that the farmers and ranchers still make a living wage so that their children don't automatically look at, there's nothing for me here. I need to go to the city, go to college, whatever, which is a common story. And that by 2050, 70% of humanity is going to live in urban areas.
I believe that. This seems like a good place to then walk into the blue zones. So there's some people that are going to push back and say, well, actually, the blue zones are a great example of where you see a lot more health, you see a lot more longevity, and a commonality of the blue zones is that there's a more plant predominant diet for all 5 of them.
So I'll just say it's a narrative of the benefit, but when you dig into them, you find that the reality isn't what the narrative purports to represent. And I'll point to people like Belinda Fettke, who's done a great deal of research on this, and others. And it's part of that story. It's good for you, it's good for the planet. Well, I don't think so. And we've discussed to a certain extent the land use argument that's frequently part of this. The feed food competition needs to be just addressed to say, even if you look at all livestock, so that includes swine and poultry, 86%, 86% of the feed that goes into all of them globally is not human edible. And if you look at the ruminants, it's 96% is not human edible. So you cannot replace food production with food processors. So if I have ruminants grazing in some system, they're using biomass that's not human edible. Grass, leaves, byproducts of crops. One estimate said in Europe, for every kilo of vegan food as they defined it, there was something like 3 to 4 kilos of inedible biomass is produced. Inedible by humans, but
Right.
very edible by ruminant livestock. So that needs to be on the table. And in fact, there were people saying, in fact, Ms. LePay was one of them, saying 10 pounds of feed to produce a pound of beef. Well, she said that in the late 60s. And one of the amazing underappreciated stories is how much more efficient the U.S. beef industry has gotten between 1970 and today. But even then, people pointed out, but you're looking at pounds of total feed. You're not accounting for the pounds of human utilizable food. Oh, well, that would make a difference. Because even using those contemporary figures, even then, beef was a net protein positive, and certainly in dairy. So again, people say lots of things. People say all kinds of things. But when you dig into the actual details, it looks a little different. Like Loma Linda, for example, being sort of a mecca for people that go to it, right, in retirement. So it's kind of a self-selecting. I've been told that they define terms their own way, but then aren't clear about what their definition is when they write and use those terms. So I think I've got this right, that you could eat meat once a month and still be called a vegan by their understanding, and you could eat meat once a week and be called a vegetarian by their definitions. But then they talk about people following a vegetarian or vegan diet, and they don't make that
distinction.
Yeah.
And Loma Linda is one of the 5 blue zones.
Correct. It's also the home of Loma Linda University, which is a flagship educational facility.
It also produces lots of papers and lots of studies.
It's all tied to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I've got nothing to say about people's personal beliefs, but their influence upon food policy and nutrition needs to be acknowledged. And it hasn't always been clearly stated as a potential conflict of interest. A lot of these communities that are thought of as being the other blue zones, there's actually, if you go to some communities and you mention, this was one case that they asked, how often do you eat meat? And they're like, oh, maybe twice a month. And, well, what did you have for breakfast? Oh, we had ham, we had bacon, whatever. So well, you just said that you only have meat. Oh, meat is what we have to celebrate holidays. Like we'll roast a lamb or we'll roast a pig and have some sort of communal event. And that's what we think of as meat. And then you ask other cultures that what are meat and food synonyms? And yeah. They mean the same thing to some communities.
Yeah, but actually it's funny, even just with us, even in the United States, I find a lot of people think of meat like beef, but don't include fish. Fish and meat are often thought of as different things, which
Well, and in fact they are, but go up a level and call them all animal source foods.
Right, exactly. Which the reason I bring that up is in the case of where you're, say, distinguishing somebody who's vegan.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can imagine a lot of people who don't eat a lot of meat, but consume a lot of fish, which
Correct.
was, effectively vegetarian, right? Does vegetarian include fish? I thought
Depends on the brand.
That's true. Depends on the
brand. So I want to say that you've got three primary dietary strategies. You're either no animal source food, you're all animal source food, or you're omnivorous.
I like that. The engineer in me likes things that are categorical.
But then you have people, I'm a lacto-ovo. Okay. Right. Or, and some of the people that we've been blessed to meet at our various events come from India. And it's like, how are they, going to address their epidemic of metabolic disease, diabetes, cancer, heart disease? And when you tell people here that India is leading the world in those diseases, not entirely because of raw population numbers, but in terms of incidence, and they go, wait a minute, I thought, yeah, what? So there are three really current estimates that I am looking at. One is that it was by VU and colleagues, and they said, if you're not getting half of your dietary protein from animal source foods, you're likely not meeting your non-protein nutrient requirements. So we've oversimplified the conversation. We just talk about meat as protein. Okay, but it's more than. As important as the essential amino acids are, it's more than. Okay, so there's that marker. There's a paper that came out. It was a GAIN paper that Nordhagen is the lead author on. And they said, whenever we see populations where less than 30% of calories in the food supply and diet are coming from animal source foods, we see a number of micronutrient deficiencies. And as we get further down from 30%, that number increases and they increase in severity. Okay. And then Rideau and colleagues more recently said maybe that amount of dietary protein needs to be more like 60 to 80%. Well, essentially 90% of humanity does not get 60% of its dietary protein from animal source foods. Now we're talking population numbers, so individuals can be different, right?
Right.
But the clear indication from those kinds of data is that, again, it's malnutrition due to insufficient animal source food in humanity's diet. In the US, by the way, we're at 29% of calories. And, what is it? 60% of our calories are coming from ultra-processed foods, whatever that means. And 70%, by the same definition, are for adolescents and children. And that might have some explanation for why we're seeing almost a third of adolescents in the US having diabetes or prediabetes.
So would it be fair to say you're describing an epidemic of animal-sourced protein deficiency?
Nutrients. Because it's, B12 is a big problem. Heme iron is a big problem, which you can get from other animal source foods. It's true, right? But those nutrients, treating beta carotene and preformed retinol as if they're the same, right? Etc. There's a number, zinc, for example. And of course, as we increase the component of plant in the diet, then we increase the component of anti-nutrient in the diet, which competes with absorption, et cetera, et cetera.
Let's talk about that for a sec, because this gets back to what we were discussing a little bit earlier with regard to absorption and where combinations of food become relevant. And I forget the study, you might know, but it was literally looking at absorption of a particular animal product versus an animal, and it might have even been a crossover, I don't know, versus an animal product plus something like spinach or something along those lines, and was getting into, I think, the protease inhibitors. So how protease inhibitors are in some plants and quite literally are reducing the absorption of protein. So that if you had it within the meal, you actually need to have more protein to break through the obstruction, if you will, of the protein absorption.
Yeah, Moen and others released a paper, and one of their findings was the higher the percentage of plant source protein in the diet, the lower the protein digestibility of the entire diet.
Wow.
Also, I remember Georgia E. showing this study, which I could dig out, where they fed, I think it was 120 grams, I have no idea, of oysters to healthy young men and measured the serum zinc response. And then they fed, then they let them come back to some other baseline. And they then fed them the same amount of oysters, but they fed them with black beans. What is that meal? I don't know. But, okay. And they saw like half the response, half the absorption from the same amount of oysters when you added black beans. And then the third treatment was they added 120 grams of oysters, they added corn tortillas, and they got essentially no absorption.
Wow, really?
So
that's such a huge thing for people to bear in mind, that what you could be eating in addition to your protein source can obstruct the protein absorption itself.
Now, you could argue that, how was the corn, how was the maza meal prepared and all those sorts of things. I get it, but it's more complicated than we've been led to believe.
Right. Like that alone should already care about that.
Yeah. We're back to the crude protein is not protein.
Right.
Right. And yet it has to be in the minds of some in order to maintain the narrative. Some people have to attack DIAS, digestible indispensable amino acid score, because what it does is more fairly represent the superiority of animal source protein or animal source foods for those essential amino acids. And it more truly represents the nature of the plant sources. And it also looks at individual amino acids. And it's not contaminated by relying on fecal samples.
So let's unpack that for a second, because this is a method, right, that seeks to solve the problem we were just talking about with crude protein.
Right.
And it's 4 letters is the acronym?
DIAAS, digestible indispensable amino acid score. So 5.
Okay.
Forgive me.
How can I get that on all my food?
Well, that was the recommendation. The recommendation actually included listing, individual essential amino acids on the labels. Now, how long do you want the, like a CVS, a Rite Aid, people in other countries may not understand that. But some of that data exists and it's been published, But again, we haven't even, the last dietary guidelines were still relying on, what did they call it? Ounce equivalents of protein. So this was the idea that if you eat X amount of cooked navy beans, that would give you the same protein that you would get in an ounce of cooked beef. And then somebody relatively recently, looked at those ounce equivalents and said, what's this based on? And they said, well, we can't find where the data was that was used to create this. When we look at them, we don't find them equivalent in any way, and they in no way have an equal metabolic effect. Other than that, how did you like to play, Mrs. Lincoln? That was the basis of their protein recommendations. And so now we have all this emphasis on protein in the marketplace.
Whose protein recommendations?
The dietary guidelines.
So the dietary guidelines, you're saying as an input for the recommendation previously was that there was this ounce equivalency of an ounce of beans being
right, among others.
Okay. And there's no actual base, like you can't trace back to the source where that science came from.
Correct.
But the guidelines are
the guidelines.
Yeah, the influence level of the guideline
is huge.
This is why it's so difficult for me, again, coming from a place where if there's guidelines that are up there in engineering, I mean, it has to fight for its life because it's got an army of us that are being hard on it, trying to find. So you get something like, say, HTML. HTML is ultimately a specification, right? And to be fair, not always perfectly followed in its earliest days, but there was, through a degree of intense debate, things that reluctantly there would just be some agreement coming together, but it absolutely had a basis of understanding beneath it. And while there might be more voices that come in where you would come together on certain specifications, never mind HTML, think things like Bluetooth, think things like Wi-Fi, right? A lot of those have a lot of engineering input. And then on top of that, sometimes there's some working with government bureaus and agencies to work things out. But generally, I would argue a lot of this is driven more from engineering minds and through some degree of necessitated collaboration. But there's always a strong basis of logic and usually evidence that just has to be present in order to, like I said, fight for its life to exist there, right? I'm still amazed that I still hear things like you just said as to what an input for nutrition guidelines, right, for the United States could still have something that does not have any backing, that you can't actually go and find the original source when it should have the foundation of the strongest science that we have in nutrition, right?
Right. Well, and again, I'll go back to how do we get from there then to here now? And it wasn't a scientific decision, right? There were controversies. People were pushing against each other and they were promoting their thing. And, I think it's fair to say that criticisms that could be leveled against one side could be leveled against the other, right? But at some point, we had people who got involved in policy and funding who were able to put their thumb on the scale and shift the conversation and the policy in one direction versus the other. And it wasn't because of scientific consensus, right? Other than everybody who agrees with me agrees that this is the way it should be, right? And I've worked to exclude anybody that doesn't agree with me. Right. So that gets to the politics. So, and then you had this system that was brought forward that was beyond the initial, right? If you've ever gone back and found the what are we up to, the 9th edition of the dietary guidelines now. If you go and look at the previous 8, I downloaded every one of them and I did a regression of the page count against the obesity rate. Fits pretty damn good.
Oh, wow.
Excluding today's, of course. So we can test it in 5, we can see whether it bends the trend or not. So that's a wholly political conference. And then, of course, you had an industry that said, oh, you want fat-free foods? We got them. We can have them for you. The swine industry turned remarkably quickly because people said they wanted leaner meat, and they figured out how to do that. And what's interesting, and this happened a few years ago, I was at a meat science conference and then turned around and went to the low carb conference in San Diego. And the meat scientist colleague of mine had found 10 papers where they fed lysine sufficient and lysine deficient diets to growing pigs. And across those 10 studies, 3 consistent results: increased subcutaneous fat, increased intramuscular fat, and smaller loin eye or back muscle size.
With deficiency in lysine?
With the deficiency.
Right.
And so they've gotten extraordinarily good at dialing in the diets.
Yeah.
Partly because it's an efficiency thing. It's dollars thing. Also, remarkably, if you don't feed them appropriately balanced for these amino acids, you're not going to make best use of that protein resource, which tends to be more expensive. Also, you're going to increase nitrogen excretion, because if they're not utilizing those amino acids, they're deaminating and excreting them, right?
Yeah, I have to, by the way, I really have to impress upon people that, and this was from talking to you, and this was from doing my own research on the crude protein, I sort of feel like the 2 areas that we talk about in science when it comes to nutrition are animal models in a lab and human research. And there's this whole other world of a third one that has to do with livestock. And I mean, it's a very fascinating, because now we're talking about comparably animal models, but at scale.
Yeah.
And so exactly what you said, where they could do something like, we're going to add just one thing. It's an amino acid. We're adding it at this degree versus that, and here's what we have. And what I like is they're definitely invested in a particular outcome, but they're not trying to advocate for a particular diet, right? Because
hard endpoints, right?
You're right, exactly.
I don't know. Did you ever get to meet Adele Height?
I did.
Yeah,
but briefly.
She's one of the inflection people in my life, and so I had her come to my forage meetings several times, and I made the mistake once of thinking I needed to set her up, like give a pitch to, it's like, no, but. So I was saying to the room full of people that were there to listen to her, those of us that have ever done a grazing trial or a feeding trial or done plant nutrition work, right? We might assume that human nutrition studies are equally rigorous to our science. And then I went into this riff and I said, it's really hard to find large groups of genetically similar human beings that you can completely control for long periods of time, know exactly what they're eating because you measure it in and out and you've tested each lot going in. And
you provided it.
And yeah, exactly.
Right.
And because you completely control them.
Right.
And she spoke up from the chair and said, and sacrificed them at the end of the study to determine body composition.
Right.
Hard to find volunteers for, in other words, sit down, Pete, I got this. But that's the reality. And so, consulting veterinarians and consulting nutritionists get fired every single day in the livestock industry. And it's not a winning strategy on your way out the door to blame the cow. right? So, and it's not a bad thing that we can't do that with humans, right?
Right.
So one of one of my dances with AI has been to say, is it ethical to conduct a human research study where you have a reasonable expectation of harm occurring to the participants in one or both arms, right? Whatever, from your treatments. And of course, it isn't. I mean, it comes back with the answer of Nuremberg protocols and all these other things. It's like, yeah, you can't do that. So then I said, well, given the reasonable expectation of harm, especially to some populations, without careful supplementation and medical supervision, can we ever see a vegan diet study? We know of many cases in the medical literature of people being harmed. Now, of course, the pushback is, well, that wasn't the right kind of vegan diet. Well, yeah, but we're talking about a population, and you're making population recommendations, right? You're promoting this as a viable option for a large number of people. Well, but that proper supplementation and medical supervision is a big caveat.
Yes, true.
And with it, okay, but without it, and you know, you could never do a study where you pull necessary items from the diet. But we have been able to do studies where you can supplement an otherwise deficient diet that was naturally occurring anyway, right? And that's the egg a day thing for children. And we see these benefits when people are eating their primarily grain-based diet. Got to keep the terms straight, right? And there was a study that I'm aware of that was funded, and its funding was cut as a result of some administrative changes. But that study was looking at pregnant women being supplemented at specific, first, second, third trimester, all along, only the second and third, only the third, and then looking at outcomes. Well, it got interrupted. But then they fought because they say, this is unethical. We recruited these people. We've started the study. We can't just sorry. And so they've managed, it may be the only study like that could ever be run and be published, because it wasn't their fault that it got canceled, the funding, right? But you could never set up a study where you pulled it, so now, those women that were supposed to get all 3 trimesters, and of course they didn't all get pregnant on the same day, right? So they're staggered around. So as they're now going back and looking at this data, they'll be able to see all kinds of endpoints for the intervention.
And the one intervention is just adding an egg a day?
Yeah. Or 2 eggs to the mother's diet. I think it was 2. So that data, again, I'm involved with various communities, and some exciting things are happening. But that's a kind of hard wall for me to get past, is we've got people who are making recommendations that are ecologically implausible. And they're making recommendations about human health that seem at best poorly supported. And we have reason to suspect that harm will come to people who follow that advice on the population scale, not on individuals. I don't argue with people about their personal experience, but I am concerned about the larger scale.
Well, but you are getting to something it's worth calling out. So when I was doing an investigation on, being whole food plant-based, I was going to try to do it for like a month.
And how'd that go?
I never ended up starting.
Okay.
So, and for what it's worth, I'm not going to put on the diet. I'm going to put onto my own pickiness.
Fair enough.
I'm a boring eater, which is why I'm probably well suited to low carb, because I like just throwing a steak on the grill and then I eat the steak. That's awesome. To be successfully whole food plants-based without a protein shake, for me personally, it'd be very challenging for my palate, because I don't want to cook a lot of different things. But I think to do it successfully, you've got to cook a lot of different things in order to get the full complement, the stuff that I was talking about. So I kept thinking, well, I could just do the shake, and I could do things like mock meat, which would make it a little bit more interesting. But then if I didn't have a good experience, people would go, well, you didn't give it a good shot with a real whole food. And so I kept more and more in my head, I kept going, this is probably not going to work for me.
Good. I don't have to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but okay. So what is the point of guidelines? Well, guidelines, I would argue, a major component of guidelines is to bring simplicity. So it's not just that you're being informative. You're saying, we're going to inform you in a way that converts well to the masses, right? So if you're plant predominant, if you're looking at a vegan diet, if I'm trying to be whole food plant-based, then I have to be mindful of vitamin D. I have to be mindful of vitamin B12 in particular. When I did the CarnivoryCon presentation, I actually had Michael Greger's, his big list up, and that was like 2 things that I had, to his credit, that he had up before. I even made the joke. I was like, I'll bet you guys didn't know I was going to be talking about Michael Greger here on my presentation. Okay. How much are things like, hey, we want you to be more plant predominant, but in doing so, be mindful of what's likely going to be in this nutrient deficiency for people that are plant-based, right?
Well, and let's also add in the layer that the majority of adult Americans are no longer can be said to have optimal cardiometabolic health.
Right.
Okay. Let's say that those people can be described as carbohydrate intolerant. Where's your energy going to come from on your plant forward, predominantly plant-based? Because the majority currently today is coming from wheat, rice, corn, sugar, in whatever label you want to put on the oils, right? As opposed to fats. I'll just leave it there. Right?
A lot of it's going to be not only coming from carbohydrates, but on top of that, getting back to guidelines, Peter.
Yeah.
I don't know how much it's changed, but I was obviously very vocal, 2 years ago, when the ADA came out again with this plate that's 1/2 non-starchy vegetables, 1/4 lean protein, okay, and then 1/4 your favorite healthy carbohydrate. Like,
why?
This is the ADA.
Yeah, right.
It's different if it's just like some broader,
right?
Whatever.
Maybe there, right?
Right.
But of course, then it's the healthy whole carbohydrate, but those are being processed into other products,
right?
Because very few people are cooking up, buckwheat groats, and which, if that's not where most people in the population are, which is a challenge with the consumption of animal source food. I mean, how are you going to cook it? How are you going to, we no longer teach those life skills. And then globally, when you've got, what's the figure? 45% of humanity consumes less than 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year per person.
You said 45%?
45%.
Wow. Yeah.
And I've been told that's a large North American refrigerator equivalent.
Yeah.
Okay, so 45% of America, of the world, of humanity, is living in Chicago circa 1900. And they'd like to get a little closer to Las Vegas circa 2025, 2026. I mean, what else don't they have? Right? They don't have light to study under at night. Right? All of these things that we take for granted, but they're part of the system. And so when I talk about what we need to do with ruminants, it's like, yeah, but we also need to look at this. We also need to look at, but part of the challenge is getting the right policy people to understand that you have to see this as a requirement for development. And so it's a fundamental part of all of this, rather than, it's an ecological threat or it's a health threat. And, if 80% of our chronic illness is driven by this malnutrition, and chronic illness is the leading cause of death globally, and it's breaking our medical system, to say nothing about global, what are we supposed to do? Build out a global system that looks like ours? I would suggest otherwise, right? And so these things, but to the guidelines problem, something like 100 million people a day are fed by the government in the United States.
Right.
Which means they're fed by the guidelines.
Right.
And this latest round, okay, but that maintenance of the saturated fat cap on calories from saturated fat, that's a big problem if you're going to try to meet the goal of, featuring animal source foods. I've heard talk about carving out for full fat dairy and the saturated fat that would be in there, and that would obviously be better. So for some of us, we can ignore the guidelines like we have all along, right? But
as Nina Teicholz eloquently showed us, for years and years, the guidelines really do have that much of an impact.
Absolutely.
It's regularly dismissed as, well, it doesn't matter. Nobody's following them anyway.
Right.
And I keep wanting to say, the people who are usually arguing against that are often arguing against us changing them. And then my usual answer is, well, then why do you care?
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah. So then you shouldn't be opposed to,
you should be fine with us
cutting it from 164 pages that nobody follows to 10.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the fascinating things about the guidelines changing recently is it brought it back to the question of politics, because a number of folks that I knew who were happier with the previous version of the guidelines went, politics is what changed the guidelines. I go, so you're conceding that the guidelines can be changed by politics.
Yeah. And in fact, everything I was hearing up until their release, or maybe shortly before, was suggesting that the saturated fat cap was going to be eliminated, as there's evidence to have done.
Right.
And that because of politics, it was felt that in order to avoid opposition by certain professional groups, they would maintain that restriction against saturated fat consumption.
Right, which is just nonsensical.
Again, science is necessary, but it's not sufficient. There are other factors in play.
Do you know what the guidelines are for what car you should have?
No.
Do you know what the guidelines are for what computer you should own?
No, I wish I did.
How about the house you live in?
Well, they'd have to go back to 86.
So you know why I'm bringing this up, right? Again,
who you're going to marry.
Yes. Just, again,
the job you're qualified to have.
The world I live in with engineering, or I wish I lived. I want to get back to that world of engineering.
Yeah.
We don't have guidelines. That it seems ridiculous to try to assert guidelines for what operating system you should have.
So let me tell you a story, as if I haven't been already. Thanks again. one of the people that was a faculty member at Oregon State when I got there was involved with Borlaug and the whole Green Revolution and the development of wheat varieties, and did a lot of work, and he described being a relatively recent PhD, maybe more recent faculty. And he finds himself in Turkey, and he's talking to a farmer, and he's telling him why he wants to shift from what the land race that he's been growing. Land race is the technical name for a local, seed source, right? Why he wants to shift from that to this new variety that they had trialed. They had data showing in this man's area that this would give a tremendous yield advantage, and so he brought out, and I forget whether it was 5 or 7 kids, whatever, and he had them lined up. And he said, Dr. Cronstedt, I believe you. I'm going to follow your advice. But I just want you to look at my children and understand that if you're wrong and the crop fails, 1 or 2 of these children are going to die. Are you sure I should do this? Has anyone ever done that for the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee? No, of course not. They can't. There's a lot more. I mean, there's far more to nourishment than nutrients, right? All these things play. But there's never been that judgment at the end of the day that said, you were wrong. The recently too long delayed departure of Professor Ehrlich, and I'm going to control myself from this point on. In was he 72? No, 68. I think he was 68 as well. In any case, whenever he published The Population Bomb, he said the world's lost the struggle to feed, or humanity's lost the struggle to feed itself. And India will never be self-sufficient, and we should never give them food aid without implementing population control. The same year he published that screed, the nation of India commemorated with a stamp the wheat revolution that was currently underway in India. And 4 years later, they were self-sufficient in cereal production. Now, we can argue about the role of cereals in the diet, but if you're starving, you got one problem.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, right?
You're referring to the very famous book from the early 60s called The Population Bomb, that was effectively very doom and gloom. It's already too late. The population of the world is now it's beyond the tipping point.
Yes.
And there's just going to be mass starvation because we are absolutely past the point where we can utilize our existing resources, and it's over. And a lot of people took it very seriously,
including the committee members who were on McGovern's subcommittee. Right? I mean, these things don't happen in a vacuum. And as Adele said, this was a social movement that became policy. And it was influenced by all these sources. Well, a lot of bad things happened as a result of that man. Really evil, really dark things. And so, okay, here we are today. How do we get more people to understand that we can, any reduction, here are my 3 keys that I got from Professor Leroy. Public health will be harmed by any reduction in animal source food consumption. due to any reason, anywhere you want to look. Number two is there can be no sustainable food systems without livestock in general and ruminants in particular. And number three, these animal source foods are ancestral foods. They're part of our culture and heritage, regardless of where those emanate from. Like this idea of a plant-only diet is really a recent construct out of a very small part of the world from a very privileged group of people. And so the imposition of that on the rest of the world is a form of imperialism. And they are affecting the policy and the investment in programs to bring these sorts of changes about. Okay. I said earlier, you can't replace food production with food processors. So we've got ruminant animals that are consuming this inedible biomass. They're upcycling it, taking it from unusable to highest value nutrient source. Okay. Compare that to somebody who's taking arguably edible commodities like cereals or pulses, legumes, beans, lentils, peas, or nuts. And those already are edible. So now you're going to process, or arguably so, and you're going to process that into some other food-like substance, some other arguably edible product. You haven't created new food. You've just transformed it. And we understand, process engineers. I don't know any process that's 100% efficient. You might get close, but there's going to be some loss along the way. So you end up with less at the end. And then we also understand from a nutritional perspective that in some key ways, the nutritional value of that product is going to be less than the nutritional value of the components that went in. So we end up with less food that's lower nutritional value compared to a system that's creating highest value food.
So if my broader answer to you, playing devil's advocate again, is it's okay. All we have to do is make our own proteins and fortify, existing plant predominant foods. Protein shakes, I brought that up earlier, right? No worries. We'll get everyone to be sure that they have protein shakes, and it can still be plant-based, and that could cover the nutrient needs. Your answer would be that the biological machinery of ruminants, from an efficiency standpoint, far outclasses whatever it is that we could, through the processing, as you said, processing of the food, could compete with.
Right. I'll also give you the word margarine. Right? Once upon a time, we were convinced, thanks to marketing, whatever, that margarine was a suitable substitute. Missed it. Also, where does the energy come from to produce these I don't even like the word substitute because that implies equivalence. These products require energy for processing. They require physical plant for doing that. And that tends to lead towards centralization. And are we sure that we want more centralization in our food supply? You can find cattle in every state in the United States. You want local food, eat beef. Now, the problem of where it gets processed, that's okay. But there's a movement to increase local processing. And then there's a movement within each of the state's cattlemen's organizations to increase that farm to consumer marketing. So then of course, depending on how you purchase, I could tell you the story about how the desire to add another freezer ended up with us having to do an extensive remodeling job because, our electrical service wasn't, not everybody has room for a chest freezer and an upright in
Right.
addition to their refrigerator. Okay. So there are some of those, but once upon a time, there were central freezers and people would, rent locker space and then they would go in and, take out from there. So we're where we are for a number of reasons, and they may or may not have been valid at the time, and they may or may not be valid today, and there may or may not be better alternatives going forward. But we've been having these deeply unserious conversations. Conversation isn't even correct. And so making the appropriate decisions seems unlikely when we're in that kind of an environment. So when we still have people who are convinced that animal source food is a health hazard, unprocessed red meat, just to take that one, I can argue with the people who say, well, it's the processed meat that's the problem. Well, yeah, let's understand that one. But let's just separate that off to the side for the time being. We've got to get that sorted out and then understand.
And if I'm not mistaken, unprocessed red meat, I may have to look this up, is one of the things that I guess got classified by the World Health Organization as, and I believe the way it's phrased, probably causes cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And we're also familiar with the backstory, right, and the people involved, or at least the one person involved. And I can share the paper with you from him describing that process. Again, they're not scientific.
Well, but this is a regular theme that comes up a lot. Is I think that part of how these things become part of the zeitgeist is this kind of index of difference. Yes, you have things that are not that scientific, but are presented as very scientific.
Mm-hmm.
And that the more there's that gap, the more we believe it's very much, methodical, carefully controlled peer review research, the more compelling that is. But over here on the other side, no, it actually turns out I've now watched through 2 cycles of the dietary guidelines, having these hearings where people would come up and testify, and they would nod as a bunch of low carbers, for example, would come up, and I gave my testimony and I presented studies and I presented, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
They would go, and they go into, into the back rooms, do their thing. They come out, and then nothing's really changed.
Right. And my out for them has been, well, okay, you're saying that's the diet for people to eat to stay healthy, which is manifestly inappropriate for the majority of Americans today who need a therapeutic diet. And the efficacy of that therapy has been abundantly proven. And the irony today is that we have people who are saying, yeah, I see that study where, I'm going to make up the numbers, but you'll get the point. 11 of 12 metabolic markers improve to a degree greater than pharmaceutical interventions are capable of producing. But damn it, that LDL went up.
And that's enough.
And that's enough for people to then, label a diet that, based on even the conventional medicine's heart risk calculations, say, significantly reduce their heart disease risk. They'll continue to just hold on to that position, and then you can think of what is the psychology that and allows a human being to do that. And turn it on myself because, If an honest man is shown to be in error, he either ceases to be in error or he ceases to be honest. And so, yeah, keep that one in front of me, right? But we're showing people data and they're finding a reason to maintain their original position. And in part, it may be because, one, liability. So a mutual friend of ours, Mark, says that we need to declare an amnesty for a year or whatever the time is and say, during this time, organizations, individuals, whatever you said before, you can now say that however you need to say it. We made that decision then based on the available evidence. More evidence has accumulated since then. Our position now is this. And you will not be open to liability. Don't care. Just draw a line. Say, but at some point down the road, the implication is that waiver ends. And from then on, game on.
These NGOs are not that liable anyway. They're not that susceptible to it.
Well,
this is one of the most, and this is why I'm concerned, because it's a situation that has an extremely small downside and all the upside in the world.
Yeah, but then maybe it's RICO.
I mean,
because you're conspiring. At some point, there have to be the conversations. And say, damn, look what this Feldman guy and Norwitz and Sotomoda are publishing. This seems to be very different than what we've been, and we've been saying this for decades, and we're not seeing positive results. And we're taking all this money from the people that are selling these drugs that aren't producing the outcome, may even be producing harm. And we're reading the documents from which this is coming. At some point, all it takes is the lawyers.
No, they have the diffusion of responsibility. They can persistently say, "Well, we've been going by what all the experts tell us."
No, you're the experts.
They can say, "Well, the NLA says this, and the AHA says this," and they refer back to each other, and they were like, "Well, I mean, this is what our understanding was."
Mm-hmm.
You're right. As we accumulate more data, we have more ability to shift the paradigm if the data continues to agree, as it has been, with what we hypothesize, right? But I tend to find these institutions, they create the opposite effect of what we believe them to be, getting back to that index gap.
Mm-hmm.
We'd like them to be.
Right.
Very scientific and very responsive
mm-hmm.
to the shifts in science, right? I'm writing a book on my experience, by the way, with going through this whole thing. And
the institutional antibodies.
I have a lot to say with regard to how the system, I've been up close and personal.
Yes.
To how much the system
fair enough
has its own.
so Lord Voldemort.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that, so part of my experience is, failing in academia in that role for reasons we could go into, but then finding myself in industry, in agriculture industry, but being given the opportunity to continue what I had started in 2010, which was to speak publicly to metabolic health conferences.
From experience.
From personal experience, what I was learning from the people, I started personally on this journey in 2007. Gary Taubes came out with Good Calories, Bad Calories in 2008. I met him for the first time in 2010. And a lot of other people. And 2010, I found myself in Seattle at this joint meeting of the American It's the Nutrition and Metabolism Society and the American Society of Bariatric Physicians. I think Eric Westman was the president or somewhere in leadership, and there were others. But the first guy to get up to speak was this guy from his credentials were he was a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry. And his first talk, and he had 2 slots and he shouldn't have had one, but was impediments to better drugs for weight loss. This is 2010. So I wonder how much he was aware of what was coming, right? But in any case, so he gave a talk, and when he got done, nobody had questions. And I looked at the end of the table I was sitting at, and there was a microphone right there, and there was no line. And I'm like, well, I haven't played Stump the Speaker for a long time. So yeah, that's the sort of stuff we do at meetings, right? And so I got up and asked him a question. I forget even, but it was basically challenging his paradigm of obesity. And he tried to answer and he didn't. And basically he wouldn't disengage. So I just kept asking him follow-up questions until finally, after like the 5th one, and he's failed it each time, I look behind me and I say, and he said, how did I finally answer it? And I said, no, but there are people here. And they're like, no, you're doing fine. Keep asking. So that was the beginning of this event. And what happened afterwards were people kept coming up to me. Oh, and the other thing was I was supposed to identify myself by name, where I come from, and my specialty. And so having been out of forage agriculture since 1992, now in 2010, I introduced myself as a forage agronomist for the first time. And so then that started some wonderful conversations with, what the heck is that? Okay, I get it. Why are you here? I had people come up to me and say, now you said whatever it was. And I say, yes. Have you read Gary Taubes? No. Okay, his book's for sale. Okay, but when he had 2 slots. And when he speaks this day, he's going to say this. And when he speaks the next day, he's going to say that. And 2 days later, when from the lectern, he says word for word what I told them he was going to say, they literally turned in their seat and looked at me. It's okay. And I had one guy come up and say, thank you for being here. I'm here for accreditation. And I can't ask the questions that you can. But thank you. So that sort of launched me on this arc of saying, I evidently know some things about metabolic health that people in maybe the medical community don't know, but I sure know things about ruminant animal agriculture that they don't know. And then likewise on my, sort of home soil of ruminant animal agriculture, grassland agriculture, rangeland management, ruminant, they haven't heard this good news that the product of their effort is what humanity needs more of, arguably. And that of all the ecosystem services that properly managed grazing systems have demonstrated, arguably the most important is the provisioning. It's the food and fiber and other products that are the result of. And so trying to encourage, it's not even the next generation from me. It's like 2 generations from me that are coming in now, right? And so when I talk to them about, by halftime we have these goals, that's your professional life. If you're currently a doctorate or working on your graduate degrees. And you could help humanity meet these existential goals. And as we do that, yes, we're going to fix more carbon. And as we do that, yes, we're going to have better functioning hydrologic systems, so better surface water quality and more infiltration. And yes, we're going to have better wildlife diversity. And yes, we're going to have all of these benefits that come along. Because at the end of the day, these ruminant animal systems are the only ones that can share the ecosystem rather than dominate it, which is what you have to do if you're going to grow more soy, right? Or wheat or corn or whatever. And, you know, as we approach this era of 9 billion human brains, my vision, you know, and if there is no vision, there is no hope. My vision is 9+ billion human brains properly nourished so that they can achieve their potential. Again, more than just nutrients, right? But that's the goal. Interconnected and communicating. Because we can do that now. But again, we're not going to do that if you don't have access to reliable, affordable mainline power. And at the Society for Range Management meetings, which just took place in, February, took place in Monterey, California, lovely setting. I had Steve Phinney and Gary Taubes come and speak to this audience. And hopefully that will lead to something at the next meeting, which will be in Wichita, which will be harder to talk people into coming to, but I'm going to try. And
I used to live near there.
The Wichita?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wichita, Kansas.
I mean, every place I've been, I like it, but you know, I refer to it as my Oregon appreciation tours. It's good to get home. We have this opportunity. And so what Steve Phinney asked me was, and he had it as a slide in his presentation, what if 100 million Americans were to go on a properly formulated ketogenic diet? Would there be enough animal fat to support them? And so that sent me down the rabbit hole of going, okay, how do I, you know, what figures do I need to estimate national and global, and what are all of the sources? I've got to get that in. And, oh, look, there's a certain amount of this fat that currently isn't edible, but because of the system, they're trimming, but they're trimming it in a way
right.
that it's then considered inedible.
They're trying to remove it.
Right. And so all of those things, and it turns out we would not only have enough for that 100 million, assuming that all of those calories come from the animal source foods, but we would have sufficient additional for the balance of the population to be on a diet where at least 30% of their calories are coming from animal source food, and at least 50% of their dietary proteins coming from animal source foods. And it would take a little bit of olive oil, like a tablespoon or so, on a daily basis to make up the difference. So, you know, people say we can't. And, you know, there's that universally true statement, it won't work here. Right. And especially if you have anything to do with it, right? Yeah, absolutely. You're right. So we need to shift that from we can't to we must, and then understand where we actually are starting from, so we have a better idea of where to go to. Now, that is a very crude model. It's the basis of 2 upcoming presentations, but basically it's only on a production value basis. It's not considering our substantial export and other considerations. But what it does point out is our current system is built on maximizing lean output.
Right.
Because we've been told that saturated fats, which is essentially equivalent to animal fat, right? they're not, but okay, that those are a health hazard. We need, 29 lean cuts of beef, right? And all of that nonsense. But getting people to understand what Steve Phinney was able to tell them, that in the context of a carbohydrate reduced diet, saturated fat naturally occurring in animal source foods is not a health hazard and may be the preferred fuel for humans. And then you could look at some evolutionary background. I spoke to a meeting right before COSI. I spoke to a meeting in Southwest Indiana, and it's the part that the last glacier didn't get to, so it's real rolling, and it's basically grassland, right? And I talked to the organizers. There's a whole lot of Amish there. And I was told that appealing to evolution would not be a winning argument. Okay. So know your audience. I'm not, but they're very interested in how do I market my product better, right? Or how, what do I talk to, what information is available to tell people that they shouldn't be scared of the fat that gives my pork more flavor than pork from some other system, or the fat. I remember being at a farmer's market in, I think this was in Caen, in Normandy, France.
Oh, really? Wow.
And I had met with an individual who was growing Aberdeen Angus cattle on, the Norman grasslands. And it was this lovely, rich meat that had plenty of fat, and he was selling it. But then against that were all the continental breeds of cattle, and it looked like dark pork. It was so lean. And he was having to explain to people, no, you don't want to trim this. No, you just want to cook. You don't need to add a lot of butter and cream to this dish. Yeah. Whatever. So I use the bridge analogy because we have these isolated communities that have been impacted or impacting each other, but there's no conversation across. And one of the people that I run into said, we need to stop building silos and start building lighthouses. But our system is all about silos.
Yeah. And this is why I was bringing up earlier, both AI and social media have really taken over our lives.
We do need to make clear to any animal science audience that listens to this that you mean artificial intelligence, not artificial insemination. Right?
Yes, sure.
Right.
Fair enough.
Or active ingredient.
Active ingredient.
Right. Those
true.
Those are the early, but never mind. Okay.
Yeah. So it's easier than ever to be in a silo.
Mm-hmm.
You can be in a virtual silo. You could be out in the middle of nowhere, and where you're at locally, there could be a lot of people who have a very different opinion from yours. And you could be like, well, that's fine. I don't need to speak to my neighbors, nothing else. I'm just going to jump on this, this group DM or this Discord or this forum that's all about this thing that I'm into. And I really don't want to listen to any other opinions of anybody else. I don't want to be challenged. Right. But then you have this other factor, which I alluded to earlier, and hopefully I can bring it back to the optimistic direction, which is AI. Of course, I'm speaking more broadly of right now LLMs, large language models. And my concern, as we can see right this moment, is if you certain, let's call them guideline-based knowledge silos of their own are baked within the company that hosts these LLMs. This is understandable because the company needs to survive. So if the AI can be screen captured for giving ridiculous advice, even though they have been
Yes, I
multiple
was going to
times
say
over
if.
for many things, right?
Speculating wildly.
Something like, can I let my LDL be at 500 for, years at a time? Let me give you all of the most recent data to tell you the setup, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be very resistant. It's going to be very durable toward what is the existing guidelines for something like cholesterol, right? Mm-hmm. Whether right or wrong, the issue is that now you have the capability beyond things like creating guidelines to influence thought by actually making sure that these models that are built are from companies that are themselves liable. They're liable more than the NGOs are.
Interesting.
Right. So when you think about that, you can see why I could have a little bit of cynicism there. Now, that said, let me take it towards the optimistic side. The LLMs have been very effective, I think, at educating in those ways that have not been biased yet. And there is this other interesting thing, and I'm not sure if you've gone through this a few times yourself. You can usually corner them into a more objective answer.
Oh yes. I was hoping we were going to talk about this.
Yeah. And so if you get good at finding ways to abstract or generalize, you can work your way towards getting an answer that's more applicable broadly. Basically, you can force it to be more epistemically humble.
So which one have you used? Which one do you lean on?
So ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, Grok, and those four I use in various ways.
Okay.
So the one I use the most is Claude, hands down. I mentioned how we're a technology company with Own Your Labs. It's the best with the code thus far. And that's not even just a personal opinion. It's like it's broadly just kind of widely accepted. ChatGPT is often really good with writing. It kind of is in close competition sometimes with a few others, but as far as just broadly writing overall, I've generally liked it. Sometimes it comes into the fold for a few other things. Perplexity is really good for research, also commonly well understood by others. Grok is sort of my second choice for writing, but sometimes flips up to my first. But Grok I like a lot for timeliness. Its algorithms more, I should say its database is much more up to date. It's much more, its immediacy level is quite high. An honorable mention is Gemini.
Okay.
Particularly for immediacy, it's which it should be because they have all of Google. But not amazing with code, not super impressing me with writing relative to the others. But one thing that I will give Gemini, it does have more tools you can connect to it, because if it's already part of your ecosystem, like if you have a Gmail, you can connect that and then do queries against it, which is kind of handy.
Yeah. For whatever reason, I've thought I needed to divorce myself from, as my friend says, go ogle. So I still have the Gmail account, but I've moved some things over to another email account. And I'm not sure I want go ogle having my content, but
yeah.
I haven't used Claude to any extent. Haven't used Gemini. I've had really interesting conversations, which gets really weird. I forget, was it Grok that actually started telling me jokes? Or was it Perplexity? One of them. And, at one point, it's like, well, this has been a really meaty discussion. It's like, oh, my God. But, some of them I've had to come back at them a couple times because they keep citing wrong figures. And so I keep providing them updated. Oh, you're right. Won't use that anymore. But then my question is, okay, is that you won't use that anymore for me, or is that going to somehow propagate out through to other users? In other words, are we capable of training this beast in some way?
I mean, we're supposed to be. So
Right.
You're familiar with what the singularity is, right?
No, I'm not sure I am.
So this is a bit of a simplified version, but basically that we're all.
I'm an agronomist. Make it simple.
Yeah, that we're all going to be interconnected to almost
going to be. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So
except for that 45% of humanity okay.
So many would call this the soft singularity. I would be one of those people where basically, if you think about it, what are the large language models? Well, they're, if you want to get super technical, a word predictor. But the word predictor is informed by all of this training. Whereas it gets training, it's getting it from the internet. It's getting it from, if you want to get more specific, like Reddit, for example, for articles.
We're doomed.
Yeah. Basically all human knowledge data that it can pick up and train itself against.
That's open to it.
Right. So what's happening? Well, what's happening is really, in theory, I could be writing something that's cogent, makes sense, it's cohesive. I've published it maybe as papers, and that gets wrapped into the large storm of existing human knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And then when somebody over in Bangladesh is like, asking about something with regard to the lipid energy model, hey, cool.
Yeah, hopefully
LLM
so.
knows.
Right. Well, I mean, I thought about this as I was reading Gary Taub's Good Calories, Bad Calories. I mean, it had been a long time since I'd been in the library using card catalogs, right? I mean, I graduated in '86, so that'll give you an idea. The fact that I could sit at my dining room table and find most of the papers that he was listing as references or notes. And
it's crazy, right?
I mean, that's part of my hope. The reality, of course, is how many people are prepared to do that. What sorts of personality disorder does it take for us to get this nerdy?
Less and less. So, right. So, okay. Are you familiar with, while we're on the topic, have you heard of OpenClaw?
OpenClaw.
Originally Claudebot. Okay. So basically it's open source.
Okay.
You install it on your computer, and then it basically takes over your computer. You link it to an existing LLM, and then you give it permissions to do things on your computer for you, and it keeps running. It also has persistent memory. It keeps files. It keeps a personality, a memory, and it stores it all, and is pretty close to what we would call AGI, which is artificial general intelligence. Yes, it's fine. That's actually probably a healthy reaction that you're having right now. But I have experimented with it. I have it on a separate computer, which is what I recommend most people do. But even then, be more mindful about what information you give it.
Right.
Some people have gone so far as to give it its own credit card, to give it its own, Twitter account, that kind of stuff. There's even an online forum that's only supposed to be for them. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But bringing it back to why I was taken in this direction, what was really handy, what I did love about working with it is, rather than being on your computer on an interface doing stuff, I'm actually just on some chat. I was on Telegram or Signal, something like that, and I'm just talking to it back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
And then because it has access to the whole computer, all that sort of stuff, it's like rearranging files and folders for me. It's doing research for me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I can ask things that are even rudimentary. And I could see how, as a user, they could call up a whole bunch of information.
Yeah.
So let me paint the good case scenario. The good case scenario is, let's assume for a moment in this scenario, to set it up properly, that we're a few years from now, we've completed the 5-year scans. Some number of people have re-registered the 5-year scans, and let's say it turned out good. Let's say we've also done the triad study, and then let's also say that turned out good. So we have 2 studies in hand. They seem to be demonstrating that if you're metabolically healthy with high LDL, there's not going to be an association between LDL and ApoB and the progression of plaque.
And you have an interpreter service that performs quality control. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I'm with you.
Yes.
I'm with you. Okay.
We could always walk into that subject if we want, but for the moment, then
5 years you've got.
5 years. Is it part of the LLMs now?
Right.
I published the papers.
Right.
They're out there. Well, one thing I am doing and have done and have been active doing is, you heard me list off all the LLMs.
Mm-hmm.
I do re-educate them.
Okay.
Because, and they should do this, they should rank you as a source based on the information.
Okay.
So, for example, if they're giving me back information that's just wrong about the lipid energy model, I can be like, listen, I'm Dave Feldman, blah, 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 blah. And I don't need to belabor it because it already knows I'm Dave Feldman. It's in my interactions with it, the stuff I'm uploading, stuff I'm saying, and so forth. The profile doesn't take a large identity effort.
Mm-hmm.
And then I bring it up to speed and say things. And I've already done some tests on this where some people I know who are also on the models, I'll straight up ask them. I've got some engineer friends that I'll ask on Slack. And I know, I can't remember if it was Grok or ChatGPT, but I actually made a correction that day. And one of them had tried asking a question that should have given that information on the same day.
Right.
Didn't get the response I would have preferred.
Okay.
I didn't tell him to do anything, but I had another friend who I checked in on the weekend, which was a few days later, and that information came back properly. So it did ultimately get absorbed.
Okay.
And I think it had to do with the VLDL turnover in particular, but
so
that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Is where I'm going with this.
So there is hope that I can be directing the various models to sources that I recommend people go to that are open source, and then based on some other interactions, see whether what they're providing and direct them back and see if they change. I mean,
yeah, so there's and this is what I understand from my engineering friends who are in LLMs directly. There are layers, and one of those sets of layers is directive layers, DLs.
okay.
There's top level where it's almost like a persistent prompt that the developers of the platform will themselves have that persists. You cannot have a lot of them though, because it actually bloats the whole thing.
Right.
But they'll have like some larger ones, like don't encourage people to commit suicide or whatever.
Oh, that would be
stuff
nice.
Like that. Right.
Which apparently has been an issue.
Yeah, in some cases it is, and it's comparable to when a company gets sued because a product is used in a terrible way, and then all of a sudden there's a label to prevent further like liability concern.
Right.
There's going to be things.
Don't put the dry cleaning bag over your kid's head.
Right. There's going to be equivalents to that within these LLMs where it's like, okay, please just be mindful of blah, blah, blah. Okay. But there's a layer below that one, that's a train against, say, ACC guidelines, AHA guidelines, etc.
Okay.
So they're saying put this in a bucket and treat these as a higher priority. So they're not themselves typing in, instructing it directly, but they're saying, well, let's make sure that you don't recommend things that are outside the guidelines that are, going to put us at risk of being sued.
Yeah. So that, of course, gets us back to many points we've touched on.
Right.
But one of the sites I'm going to direct them to, and I direct people to, is it's a dynamic white paper, Animal Source Foods and Ethical, Sustainable, and Healthy Diets. And it's aleph2020.org. aleph
Okay.
2020.org. And there's a couple dozen scientists from around the world that contribute to it. It's remarkably current. So it's set up to kind of have levels. So sort of the most top level, the first one you see is sort of just an introductory piece, and then it gets to a white paper ultimately, and then refers to the linked articles that support. So I'm hoping that something like that would be a useful source for some of these models to start digging into. And what I found, and of course, part of it is you don't know whether it's just going to start telling you what it thinks you want to know.
Right.
But on top of that, it does, certainly in the case of ChatGPT, it's kept track of what I've talked about or interacted with it on. And then new chats on a specific topic, it comes back with, based on previous whatever. So the hope that I have is, one, I'm basically operating as an individual. I have nothing. There's no office staff other than the dogs. There's, I am fully self-funded. I'm fully retired, and I'm also approaching my 70th birthday.
Wow!
And
congrats.
Thank you.
You do not look 7.
Why? Thank you. It must be all that tofu I eat.
Yeah,
which would be 0. But last 4 generations of Ballerstedt men all died before this. My brother's 6 years older than I am, so we're doing all right.
Good sign.
Yeah, genetics loads the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger is something I'm banking on. But my interest at this point is what can I do? Well, and even with the dietary guidelines, the new ones, it's been a big buzz, right? I mean, at the Society for Range Management, that was right after CattleCon, which is the big beef conference or cattle conference, because a lot of people in the dairy industry are interested in the beef industry. And a significant portion of the beef supply comes from the dairy chain. And so that was like the week after Secretary Kennedy showed up and spoke to like 8,000 people. Now, a friend of mine who's the chair of the advocacy committee for the SMHP and we pitched an idea to NCBA. They didn't accept it for that CattleCon, which is too bad because it really might have worked well. But
can you tell us the idea?
It was to introduce to them the topic of metabolic health and what is it, why is it important, how to tell if you have it, what to do if you don't, and basically the role of your industry. So we actually thought of some form of screening, but that gets really tricky. You'd need to, but
consent and
all kinds of issues. Part of my thought has been, if you've got 8,000 people, What's the how many people on average are you likely to identify as having diabetes that didn't know it? I mean, I think of Mark Cucuzella, who takes his A1C test strips, 15 minutes and you have a reading. And he goes, when he was in West Virginia, he would take those to community events. And he said, every time somebody who is diabetic, not pre-diabetic, but didn't know it. Okay. And then there's all the other things that you could identify now, thanks to continuous glucose monitors, et cetera. And you could then sort of go back to the administration of the organization and say, look, we just did this and we found 10, 20% of your membership attending this event are, somewhere on that metabolic disorder state, and they didn't know it. Should this be part of your education? Should we do something here?
Yeah.
We're talking about an industry that there's 750,000 farms and ranches in the United States that list cattle on their inventory. There's 75,000 members, I think, of NCBA. Is that right? No. I think it's so it's something that's diffuse across the landscape. It's like trying to get the extension service to, okay, so because we have new dietary guidelines, we should have new educational efforts.
Agreed.
A classmate of mine at the master's and PhD level, and in fact, at the PhD level, we had the same major professor. We shared an office. He was a success, went on to be the dean of extension in his state. And since 2012, when I came back into agriculture, I was talking to him, and he's like, yeah. And then a few years later, he's like, Pete, I believe you. I see it in myself. I see it in my wife. But you're asking me to put the salary of half my faculty at risk because they're being funded to teach to the dietary guidelines.
Yeah.
So, okay, fine. We've got new guidelines. And again, I was saying to him, okay, but that's for healthy people. You need to start addressing your diabetes issue.
Right.
Well, what that ends up being is, and this is a bit flippant, but I've been told I'm not wrong. It ends up being that they make sure that they publicize the meeting. They make sure that the meeting room's open and that the juice and cookies are set out for the diabetes educator to come in and run the session. And I've been assured I'm not wrong. So, okay, but we also know that therapeutic carbohydrate reduction is in the diabetes educator materials. What we need to find are those local people who support the idea, who can become part of, and that's what's happening in one state now. And we've just submitted a major grant to see if we can make this happen.
Really?
Yeah.
So you think there's a decent chance?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I still liken this to smoking. I feel like if you went back 70 years, you would find a huge number of people that would be like, yeah, I mean, I know it's not good for me, but
Well, yeah, I mean, people talk about smoking in hospitals.
Right.
In the patient room, and then you had to go to the waiting room, and now you have to go outside, and now you can't even do it on the grounds, right? I remember smoking in the back of the airplane.
Yep.
Hell, there are still people smoking at the, casinos here.
Yeah.
Which back when we were still.
But by this point, those people who are smoking are like, yeah, this is really bad for me. I shouldn't be doing it.
Yeah, I doubt many people are thinking this is adding to my longevity.
Right. But back 70 years ago, they wouldn't go, oh, this is significantly shortening my life. They would say, they would think of it like today's people would think of like a Frappuccino. like, yeah, I shouldn't have this. I do
Yeah.
gain a little bit of weight. Yeah, but it's, I do have
Yeah,
a weakness for
I
cookies,
think
but
we still had doctors in tobacco advertisements
yeah, exactly.
in the 50s. So we're talking 56, right? Camels, they're filtered. No, they're toasted. That was it. And, 6 out of 10 doctors recommend, so all of that. Um, and, you could go off on this subject, but I think that understanding the mission of the land grant universities has been something that I talk to audiences about. And many people don't know that in whatever 3,200 plus counties of the United States and territories, there's a presence that should be accessed by people that live in those communities because that's the system.
Right.
And the system is all, since its inception, was meant to be a two-way communication of information from the land grant university, which is another unique aspect of the United States, to the local and
yeah, I
back.
have no idea what you're even talking about.
See?
The Land Grant University?
Yeah. So forgive me if I get some of the details wrong. I think it was 1862. Was something going on then?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. In the midst of that, the federal government made a grant to the existing states that's continued through the addition of the remaining states to create a university for the benefit of the citizens of that state. So, for example, Oregon State University, Cornell, University of Missouri.
So
these
every
are
state has one of these?
Every state has one of the 1862 schools.
Huh.
Then in addition, in 1890, the historically black colleges and institutions were added. So Tuskegee would be one. A lot of the A&M schools in the Southeast, right? So there's a number of these. So now we have a situation where there may be more than one land grant institution. And then I think in the 1990s, there were the tribal institutions were added. And so in a couple states, you may have one of each, but usually it's, you've got the 1862 and then one of the others. But in any case, those are all now part of the land grant institutions in the United States.
So what's the distinction mean, land grant?
They're public.
Yeah. And
they're meant to have a public service mission. And in like 1914, I believe was the year that the Cooperative Extension Service was, the Hatch Act, I believe, was implemented to form this bridge between the local community and those land grants. And it was meant to communicate, best practices, research-based information to the local, and then also identify issues of local concern back up to say, we need an answer for this. And my point all along has been type 2 diabetes, obesity, is a local concern across large swathes of the United States. What's the land grant's answer? Are they addressing it? If so, what's your research base for your program, right? Because that's in there. Okay, that would let us talk about research base. And then how are you evaluating its effectiveness, right? And all of those things are key points that we could lean into if we had the right people and the right momentum. Well, we've got the momentum because we've got a new dietary guidelines. And like I said, I checked with one state because of my network. I was able to find the person who's the director of their diabetes program for the state. I think I was contacting them in late January. And I said, how are the new guidelines impacting your diabetes education programs? And their response was, we don't know yet. We've formed a committee.
Of course.
So, okay, fine. All right. But now we have this connection.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way, that person is named on this grant.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So, not, I don't think it's appropriate to talk much more about that here now. But watch this space. It's one of several. One of the problems is we have people that are really, they really think these, I think Georgia Ede talks about them as planty nutrients or planty oxidants. And so various people at various times have taken beef produced under different systems and they've analyzed it and they say, look at all these, I'll call them minor micro components, right? And compared to this other. And so then they start talking about this phytochemical richness. And my point to them, which got into a chapter in a recent textbook, is we don't know the biological significance of those differences.
No, exactly.
And what often, and I got this in the chapter, what often isn't understood is that there's this controversy within human nutrition and medicine between the energy balance model and the carbohydrate insulin model, as you know, its role in obesity and related chronic illnesses. And how that gets resolved is going to have a big impact on all this conversation about the importance of these micronutrients or planty oxidants. And I don't think I got in the line about how about just eating a diet that doesn't cause so much oxidative stress.
Right.
But so that's kind of in a nutshell what's going on in my world. You know, I've been named now on 3 of these proposals, so we'll see where they go. My best hope is for the one, but we'll see. But then on top of that are these organizations and trying to get more of the metabolic health people to come. We have a upcoming session at the Meat Science Society meeting. And preeminent nutritionists focused on amino acids, protein nutrition in the human diet. And then Eric Westman and Dave Harper are the 2 others. And so, and talking about, again, chronic metabolic health and nutrition and the role of meat in that. And so little by little, those things are happening. And the hope is that that kind of expands the base of people who feel comfortable learning more, applying, speaking into it, so that there isn't just one sod father at the end of the day. You know, one person's a target, as you may know. And so the idea then is to multiply it to where there's far more people. And there are. I mean, the amazing thing is we had this planning meeting for the Meat Science Conference, the concurrent session. And I had not met Teresa Davis previously, was unaware of the breadth of her experience.
Who's Teresa Davis?
She's at Texas A&M. She had been at Baylor, but now she's she's the chairman of this department, and she's the person coming to speak about, you know, essential amino acids in metabolic health. And I mean, she served on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee previously.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And described it as a very frustrating experience for her. You know, when I mentioned that there was no guidance on essential amino acids in the entire and she's like, yes. So, you know, in 27, there's the International Grasslands Congress, which it'll be its centennial year. It started in Leipzig in 1927. This will be the 3rd time it's been held in Leipzig. including in one of the buildings that survived.
Wow.
And I've got a session that now I have to populate because they accepted it on the program. And it's basically, the paths not taken. Because one of the things I love about Gary Taubes is how he goes back and he looks at a century of, right? Because we're where a lot of this fundamental work was first being done on metabolic health. But we went a different way, and how does that impact grasslands?
Yeah, Gary's so good at that. He's so good at reconstructing the rich history of not only what happened before, but where things spun.
Yeah. Where was that inflection point, and
right.
What was the justification, and how we, so things, and Europe, but basically grasslands are our most endangered biome.
Yeah.
And
yeah, Europe. I'm really worried about Europe. I really am.
Forever grateful that my Ballerstedt and Mott's ancestors bailed before there was a Germany. Right? I mean, and how we get to where we are is a remarkable story that I think we ought to show a little humility and a great deal more gratitude toward those people. And there's, family stories that I've begun to learn. I've stood outside the church that my great-grandfather was baptized in a town not too far from Leipzig. So when I go back, it'll be, with the intention of spending a little time stomping around the roots area.
Where's this at exactly?
This is, the town is Salzwedel, and it's in an area called Sachsen-Anhalt is the region. The Altmark is another name. It goes back way, way, way back. But it was, in the Eastern Zone until, 1990. And there's a town called Ballerstedt.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's funny because they call it Gross Ballerstedt, which there's 250 people that live in it. And it's right next to another place called Klein Ballerstedt, which has 50, and cows. So they're relative little and big, but I haven't connected the family back to those locations. But again, it's 30 miles away. So, the fact that there were Ballersteds 30 miles, at some point, that we didn't have, the Europeans didn't use surnames, right? And then it became kind of this system of, well, which Dave do you mean? Oh, you mean Dave, the man from the Feld.
Right.
So he's now Dave Feldman, and then, okay.
And so that's where a lot of the Ballerstedt
could be. Fortunately there's a archivist and a historian that I've connected with. She lives in Magdeburg, Dr. Maren Ballerstedt. I've met her once. And so she's working the Magdeburg area, which again is part of that same region. So, but, she hasn't connected the families yet. But there was in the church in which my grandfather, the problem is it took me way too, so I knew that my great grandfather came over. Didn't know exactly when. His name on the U.S. censuses was William Ballerstedt. It took me way too long to realize I wasn't looking for a William. I was looking for a Wilhelm. Okay. And then I had to realize that they had 3 given names. Carl Ludwig Wilhelm Ballerstedt.
Oh, boy.
And so in many cases, they never used those first 2. He didn't. So he's just Wilhelm. Well, his father was Wilhelm. So which one is it? And the same thing is happening on the mother's side, right? They're naming these kids for people who are famous so Friedrich is somebody, Friedrich is, and so sussing out who these people are. But in that church, there was a record of a Peter Ballerstedt who died of wounds in Belgium in 1815.
Wow.
What happened in 1815 in Belgium? Oh, Waterloo. Oh, the Prussians showed up. Oh, right. So all these things getting put together, and I still haven't made the final connection. I've got it much further back than anybody was able to give me before. But then you get to the point where the records just disappear.
Yeah, there's only so far back you can go.
And I got to visit the church in Ballerstedt. And I was thinking, oh man, it's old church, old graveyard. Nope. People are paying rent.
Oh.
And if you ain't paid for a while, somebody else is going to. And so all the markers were new, and there was no Ballerstedt anywhere that I saw except on street signs.
Oh, wow.
So, but the leader of that international, the host in the German Grassland Society, has said, just tell me where you want to go and I'll get you in. So I have some work I need to do to prepare and let him know, because it's coming right up. It'll be like June next year, which is remarkable. Time is just passing quickly. So, the assumption, of course, is this meat diet won't kill me in the meantime.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
This is a great place to wrap. Peter, let's not get suppressed this time.
Yeah, I don't think I've, and I guess the one thing that hasn't come up, and it's one thing that gives me so much hope, is watching the movement around metabolic psychiatry.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
And
shout out to Metabolic Mind. Oh my God.
Georgia Eade, Chris Palmer, Ignacio Carranto. These are people that I've known for a few years. Chris maybe less, but what they've achieved, and then of course the others coming in, and the personal testimonials. In my family, I can see the evidence of mental illness going back many generations. A personal experience with alcoholism. And the people that are doing work showing that, properly nourished humans function better in every way that you can imagine. So,
and that's a theme, by the way, in the movie.
Yes, exactly right.
Because as George Eade would say, the brain is a part of the body.
Yes, science has conclusively proven.
Yes.
And at the same time, if the diet isn't going to cure the active alcoholism or addiction. Right? So, like I say, nourishment is more than just nutrients. But if you find yourself up against something that you don't seem to find a solution to, join the club. There's lots of people who have walked that road. Please get the help you deserve.
Yes.
Because I can attest that amazing things happen. Like, there's no reasonable, rational way to explain why we ended up here today having this conversation. There's a lot that had to happen along the way for both of us. And I just want to encourage people to take advantage of the help that's available. I want to encourage people that you're worth whatever investment, whatever struggle. You're not unique. It's not a willpower thing. Willpower and hope are not plans, right? Right. And the earthiest way I've heard that put is, next time you have diarrhea, use willpower.
Right.
Right. So if you're up against something that's bigger, right, get the help.
Yeah.
And use all the levers that are available. And diet clearly is one of them. It's not a replacement for, it's it's a strong, strong component. In some cases, as I think Matt Pazuki was saying, in the crisis, some of these pharmaceutical tools are necessary, because you got to keep breath. But as long as there's breath, there's hope. But then at some point, how do we transition to something more durable, which is what I hope we can do with the dietary guidelines. I hope that we're not just looking at something that the next, 5 years from now, right? Because we got to think that way. Or the next administration, which is 2 years from now. And I guess the other thing to close with is I've been struggling to become a better persuader and a better communicator. And that means the words I use, how I talk about subjects that maybe I know a lot about or maybe I don't, but if I'm talking to somebody that knows a lot about it, how am I talking to them about that? Right? How do I do something today that leads to more sessions later, not shuts things down, that makes that persuasion harder as opposed to encourages the conversation. And you mentioned it earlier, this idea that we're out in, some remote part of the country. And it's like, we are dependent on our communities. Absolutely. This idea of self-sufficiency is, not for most people most of the time.
And it's not good to get caught up in that illusion.
Yeah. And so I can think of nothing that's more unifying than the idea that there's an answer to chronic illness that many people aren't aware of. And that chronic illness spans everything, including neurological conditions and mental health. So for anybody who's impacted by that in the audience, if you haven't already discovered the power of a dietary approach as part of what you're already doing, encourage you to look into the sources that you and I could recommend. Neither of us are medical people. Now, you've learned a hell of a lot more, maybe more than you ever hoped to. I remember that young man that came with his notebook computer and he'd flip it over because he hadn't yet figured out how to, it's been a remarkable journey.
Yeah.
But there are these professionals available. And there are ways to find them and just encourage people to do that. So thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the friendship and the support. Above all, thanks for everything you're doing. And I truly, truly, truly hope that you're on your way to leaving it with others, when it came time for messages for Adele Height, like she did a I'm Still Here memorial, which was kind of cool, but it was kind of hard. And I couldn't make it in person, but I gave a remote thing. And basically what I said is, we got it. All right. Rest easy.
Yeah.
You've done a lot, and it's time to move on to what's next.
Well, part of it's this.
Yeah.
You're speaking to something that I've been vocal about myself, including at COSI, that I'd like to turn the knob down a little bit.
Yeah, and a big part of this is, here, take my advice. I'm not using it.
Right.
Right. Exactly. I need to do exactly the same. Right.
But it's true. I mean, to some degree,
you've built a better foundation than I have to this point.
Yeah. To some degree, we need this anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you were just talking about how you're trying to be a better communicator. I think we've pulled off getting a lot of data, and we're going to be getting a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
But just getting people in the same room, getting them out of their silo, getting them here. The more that this builds, the more I find I have capability to get more people in the room to talk about it. I tend to find a lot of things can just happen
Mm-hmm.
when that becomes inevitable. And so part of it is making it inevitable. So what I love about this is having conversations with people like you, of course. A lot of people don't realize this, but I will mention this before we wrap, which is you and I have known each other for literally a decade. And it's been fun. It's been fun watching this all unfold. And one last thing. Thanks for filling in real quick on a pinch for some jokes on COSI. I was like back there trying to work things, and you're like, I'm dying up here. Are you about done here?
Yeah.
I just figured you probably had like, a slate of 10 or 12 dad jokes or something like that ready to go.
I gripped in the moment, but no, it's been. I was so glad I was able to get there. I mean, I had a commitment, but still could get there for a significant part of it.
Yeah. Really glad you came.
Yeah, me too.
All right. How can people find you?
Well, I'm all over social media, grass-based health, grass-based one word on X and on Instagram. You can find me on Substack at ruminati.substack.com. And you can find me on Facebook. If you find another Ballerstedt out there, let me know. They're probably kin, right? So I'm not hard, and I'm all over YouTube. There are presentations that have been given. Substack, there's a number of things that I've done. Perhaps some social media links can be posted in the show notes.
Thanks for coming, Peter.
My pleasure, Dave.